They say family is supposed to have your back. Mine had a knife ready for it. The morning that changed everything, I stood in my childhood home, frantic, searching for my car keys. The interview of my lifetime was in 40 minutes, one shot to escape the life I'd been suffocating in for 35 years. Then I saw him, my sister's 7-year-old son, dangling my keys with a smile that wasn't innocent at all. "Mommy said you'd stay home if I kept these," my sister smirked. Not surprised. Not sorry, proud. I turned to my mother, the woman who raised me, waiting for her to fix this nightmare. Instead, she sighed like I was the problem and said 5 words that shattered everything. "Don't overreact. He's just playing." In that moment, I made a choice that would change all our lives forever. 10 years later, they walked into my office, desperate for help, and this time I held every single card. Stay with me, because what happens next will shock you and the ending. Even I didn't see it coming. My name is Catherine Lewis. I'm 35 years old, and until recently, I worked as a mid-level HR coordinator at a regional office supply company. If you'd asked me a month ago to describe my life, I would have said, fine. That carefully neutral word people use when the truth is too complicated to explain. But fine was a lie I'd been telling myself for 3 decades, and it all started long before I was old enough to understand what was happening. I was 7 years old, the first time I realised something was wrong. I'd won the regional spelling bee beating kids 2 grades older than me, and came home clutching the trophy like it was made of solid gold. My mother looked up from the kitchen table, where she was helping my older sister Alison with basic multiplication, smiled briefly and said, "That's nice, sweetheart. Go put it in your room." Then she turned right back to Alison, her voice warm and encouraging. "See, you're getting it now. I'm so proud of you for trying so hard." Alison had gotten 3 out of 10 problems correct. I'd just won a competition against 50 other children. But somehow, her struggle was worth celebrating, while my victory earned a distracted smile and a dismissal. The pattern repeated itself year after year, with soul-crushing consistency. When I made the honour roll every semester, my report card got a signature and went into a drawer. When Alison scraped by with C's and 1 B-, we went out for ice cream to celebrate her improvement. When I won a state science fair medal at 11, my mother missed the ceremony because Alison had a cold and needed someone to bring her soup. When I earned a full academic scholarship to college at 16, my mother cried not from pride, but because it meant Alison would be home alone without her sister. The message was always the same, delivered in 1,000 subtle ways. My success was expected unremarkable nothing to make a fuss about. Alison's mere survival was a triumph worthy of parades. I learned to ask questions. "Mum, why didn't you come to my awards ceremony?" The answer was always some variation of the same script. "Your sister needs more support. She's more fragile than you. You're so strong and capable, you don't need me there the way she does. You understand, don't you?" And because I was a child desperate for approval, I said yes, I understood. I trained myself to understand. I swallowed every disappointment, every dismissal, every moment of being overlooked, and I told myself it was because I was strong. Being strong meant needing nothing. Being strong meant being invisible. So I became a ghost in my own family. I stopped sharing my achievements because the silence that followed hurt more than not telling them at all. I stopped asking my mother to attend my events because her reasons for saying no always made me feel selfish for wanting her there. I learned to celebrate alone, to comfort myself, to be my own cheerleader, because no one else would. I compressed every feeling, every hurt, every longing, every moment of rage at the unfairness into a tiny airtight box inside my chest. I became excellent at pretending I didn't need what everyone else seemed to need naturally, to be seen, to be celebrated, to matter. What I didn't understand then was that I was teaching myself a devastating lie. I believed that love was something you earned through perfection, and silence, something you had to deserve through being strong enough not to need it. Meanwhile, Alison learned that love was hers by birthright, that weakness was currency, that other people existed to prop her up. We were both being damaged, just in different ways. And 30 years later, that damage would detonate in ways neither of us could have predicted. But I didn't know that everything I'd endured was just the beginning. Fast forward 28 years and you'd think I would have learnt something. I hadn't. I was still trying to earn approval through achievement, still chasing the validation that had been withheld my entire childhood, still believing that if I just succeeded hard enough, someone would finally see me. At 35, I was an HR coordinator at a forgettable company living in a modest apartment, an hour away from my childhood home, maintaining just enough contact with my family to avoid being called cold, but not enough to actually be hurt by them anymore. Or so I told myself. Then I got the call that changed everything. Morris & Garrett Corporation, one of the most respected firms in the region, wanted to interview me for a senior management position in their leadership development program. It was the kind of opportunity that could transform my entire career in one leap, the chance to finally break through the ceiling I'd been bumping against for years. For 3 days after getting that call, I walked around in a daze of cautious hope, terrified to believe it was real, but unable to stop imagining what it would mean. This wasn't just a job. It was validation. It was proof that all those years of being overlooked hadn't been because I wasn't good enough. It was my chance to become undeniable. Of course, the universe has a sense of humour. 2 weeks before my interview, my car broke down catastrophically. The mechanic delivered the news with the apologetic tone of someone about to ruin your month. The transmission was shot, the repairs would take at least 5 days, and I was looking at a bill that would drain my emergency fund. I had exactly 3 days until my interview and no vehicle. My mother, hearing about my predicament through the family grapevine, called with an offer delivered in that tone of maternal martyrdom. I knew too well. Just come stay here for a few days. Your old room is still available. It's silly to waste money on a rental car when you have family. I should have rented the car. I should have walked the 40 miles if necessary. But I was trying to save money, and some small stupid part of me still wanted to believe that maybe things had changed. Maybe after all these years I'd come home and be treated like an adult, like someone whose presence mattered. I was wrong within the first hour. Walking back into my childhood home was like stepping through a time portal designed specifically to erase every ounce of growth I'd achieved. My old bedroom hadn't been touched in years, except to become a storage space for Alison's overflow boxes of her failed business ventures, bags of Ethan's outgrown clothes, holiday decorations stacked in corners. My trophies and awards had been packed away to make room for framed photos of Ethan at various ages, his gap-toothed smile beaming from every surface. I set my suitcase down and felt 14 years old again, invisible and disposable. Alison was staying at the house too, having moved back in 6 months earlier, after her third business venture collapsed and her husband left her. She'd enrolled Ethan in the local elementary school and settled back into her childhood bedroom, like she'd never left, which, in many ways, she hadn't. At 42, my sister had perfected the art of permanent adolescence, still expecting the world to accommodate her whims and still having our mother rush to make it happen. And then there was Ethan. 7 years old, bright-eyed and utterly unburdened by concepts like consequences or boundaries. He was a whirlwind of noise and demands racing through the house, shrieking about cartoons and video games, leaving toys scattered like landmines, interrupting every conversation with urgent needs that always somehow required immediate adult attention. When he knocked over my laptop on the first evening, I'd been reviewing my interview notes and it hit the hardwood floor with a sickening crack. Alison laughed and said, "Oh, he's just excited, you know how kids are." My mother nodded indulgently, already moving to comfort Ethan, who'd started crying at my sharp intake of breath, not from guilt, but from startlement. No one asked if my laptop was okay. No one suggested Ethan apologise. Within seconds, I was the villain for reacting, and Ethan was the victim who needed soothing. The laptop screen had a hairline crack across one corner, but it still worked, so I let it go. I always let it go. That was my role, the understanding one, the flexible one, the one who didn't make waves, because making waves meant becoming the problem. The next 2 days followed the same exhausting pattern. I tried to prepare for my interview while Ethan careened through the house and Alison complained about her ex-husband, her failed boutique, how hard it was to be a single mother, how lucky I was to be child-free and able to focus on my career. My mother orchestrated everything around Alison's moods and Ethan's whims just like always. I was there physically present, but I might as well have been furniture. At dinner, they discussed Ethan's upcoming birthday party for 45 minutes. No one asked about my interview. When I mentioned it once trying to participate in the conversation, my mother said, "That's nice, dear," and immediately turned back to discussing whether Ethan's party should have a superhero theme or a dinosaur theme. I went to bed the night before my interview with my alarm set for 5:30 in the morning. My interview outfit carefully laid out my notes, reviewed until I had them memorised. This interview was scheduled for 9 o'clock 40 minutes away. I'd have plenty of time to dress review my materials one final time, maybe even stop for coffee to calm my nerves. I needed this to go perfectly. I needed this chance. I fell asleep rehearsing answers to potential questions, imagining the moment they'd offer me the position, picturing the look on my family's faces when I finally achieved something too big to ignore. The morning of my interview, I woke up early and reached for my car keys. And they were gone. I checked the nightstand 3 times, patting the surface in the dim pre-dawn light, as if my keys might materialise through sheer will. Nothing. I dropped to my knees and swept my hand under the bed, finding only dust and a forgotten sock. My purse, hanging on the back of the door, where I'd left it the night before, contained everything except the one thing I needed. My heart started hammering against my ribs in that particular way that signals the beginning of genuine panic. 6:45 a.m. I had 2 hours and 15 minutes to get to an interview that would take 40 minutes of driving, assuming decent traffic. Still manageable if I could find my keys in the next 10 minutes. I moved through the house like a small tornado, checking coat pockets, couch cushions, kitchen counters, bathroom vanities. My mother's bedroom door was closed. She never woke before 8, and I didn't want to disturb her over what might still be my own carelessness. Alison's door was also closed, but I could hear Ethan's voice coming from downstairs, the high-pitched chatter of a child already awake and animated despite the early hour. I found him in the backyard, spinning in circles, on the dew-wet grass, his pyjamas soaked to the knees, and in his small fist, catching the early morning light, were my car keys. He was holding them up like a trophy, watching them spin and glitter as he turned. When he saw me standing in the doorway, he didn't startle or look guilty. He smiled. It was a strange smile for a 7-year-old too, knowing too pleased with itself. There was something rehearsed about the way he held the keys just out of easy reach, as if he'd been waiting for this exact moment. "Ethan, I need those keys right now." I kept my voice level calm, the way you're supposed to speak to children. "I have somewhere very important to be." He giggled and danced backward, holding the keys behind his back. "Finders, keepers. Ethan, this isn't a game. Those are mine, and I need them immediately." The panic was climbing my throat now, sharpening my tone despite my best efforts. 7 o'clock. 2 hours. "Where did you find them?" "In your room." "On the table. I wanted to see what they opened." He was still smiling that odd practice smile, but his eyes kept darting toward the house as if waiting for someone to appear. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Alison emerging from the kitchen, coffee mug in hand, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She was already dressed, which was unusual for her at this hour. When she saw the scene in the backyard, me tense and desperate. Ethan holding my keys, I caught something flash across her face. It lasted maybe half a second, but I saw it clearly. Satisfaction. Pure, undiluted satisfaction. Then, like a switch being flipped, her expression morphed into concerned confusion. "What's going on, Ethan? What do you have?" Her voice was perfectly calibrated maternal concern, but she made no move to actually retrieve the keys. Instead, she walked to position herself between us, one hand resting protectively on Ethan's shoulder. "He has my car keys, Alison. My interview is in 2 hours. I need them now." My voice was shaking and I hated myself for it. Hated that I was the one who sounded unreasonable while she stood there radiating calm, parental authority. "Oh, sweetie." Alison looked at Ethan with exaggerated patience, not quite suppressing a small smile. "Did you take Aunt Catherine's keys, you silly boy? That's not how we play, remember? But it's just harmless fun, Cat. He's 7. You know how kids are, they don't understand these things. Ethan, give Auntie her keys back." But she didn't take them from him. She didn't reach out and pluck them from his hand, the way any parent would if they actually wanted their child to comply immediately. She just stood there, a human shield between me and the keys I desperately needed, while precious minutes ticked away. Ethan looked up at his mother, then back at me, and what he said next landed like a bomb in the quiet morning air. "I wanted you to stay home and play with me. Mummy said you'd stay if I kept the keys." He said it with the simple honesty of a child who doesn't yet understand the weight of what he's revealing, repeating words that had clearly been fed to him maybe last night, maybe this morning, while I'd still been sleeping. The world seemed to tilt sideways. I stared at Alison, waiting for denial, for shock, for anything except what I saw, a momentary tightening around her eyes, a barely perceptible clench of her jaw before she laughed. She actually laughed. "Ethan, what are you talking about? I never said that. You're confusing things again. You know how you mix up your stories." She ruffled his hair affectionately. Her performance of innocent motherhood, so practiced it would have been convincing if I hadn't seen that flash of satisfaction, if I hadn't heard the specificity of Ethan's statement. Kids have such imaginations. He probably had a dream or something. "Ethan, stop being silly and give Aunt Catherine her keys. She needs to go to work." "But you said," Ethan started, confusion creeping into his voice, now uncertainty replacing the rehearsed confidence. "I said give them back," Alison interrupted gently but firmly, and this time she did take the keys from his hand and held them out to me. "There, see, no harm done. He was just playing. You're not going to make a big deal out of this, are you? He's just a little boy." I took the keys from her hand, my fingers numb, my mind reeling. It was 7:15. I could still make it. I could still get there on time if I left right now, if I didn't stop to process what had just happened, if I didn't let myself think about the implications of, "Mummy said you'd stay if I kept the keys." But I couldn't move. I stood there staring at my sister, searching her face for some sign of remorse, some acknowledgement of what she'd just done. There was nothing. Just that same mask of maternal patience and slightly amused tolerance for her precocious child. Ethan sensing the tension he'd created, but not understanding it, looked between us with growing distress. His lower lip began to tremble. "Did I do something bad?" he asked, his voice small and genuinely confused. He wasn't acting now. He really didn't understand why the fun game had suddenly filled the air with ice. And just like that, I was the villain. Because if I said yes, if I acknowledged that what he'd done was harmful and deliberate, I was the cruel adult attacking a confused child. If I showed any anger at all, I was overreacting to innocent, childish mischief. Alison had engineered the perfect trap, and we were all playing our assigned roles exactly as she'd scripted them. But the deepest cut was about to come from the person I thought would protect me. My mother appeared in the doorway, still in her bathrobe, drawn by the commotion, or perhaps by some maternal radar that detected conflict brewing. Her hair was uncombed, her face creased with sleep and irritation at being woken earlier than her usual hour. She took in the scene with bleary eyes, me standing rigid, with my keys clutched in my fist, Alison, with her hand on Ethan's shoulder wearing that expression of patient martyrdom, and Ethan himself looking increasingly upset as he picked up on the adult tension swirling around him. "What's all this noise about?" My mother asked, her tone already edged with the weariness of someone who doesn't want to deal with whatever drama she's walked into. "It's barely 7 a.m. The words came tumbling out of me before I could stop them, propelled by panic and hurt and the desperate need for someone, anyone, to acknowledge what had just happened. "Mum, Ethan took my car keys. I've been searching for them for half an hour. My interview is in less than 2 hours. He said Alison told him to hide them so I'd stay home." My voice was shaking, climbing higher with each sentence, and I could hear myself starting to sound hysterical. I tried to pull it back, tried to sound rational and calm, but the tears were already forming hot and unwanted in my eyes. This interview could change my entire career. It's the most important opportunity I've had in years, and oh, for heaven's sake, Catherine. My mother cut me off with a sigh that suggested I was being exhausting on purpose. She shuffled fully into the kitchen, heading straight for the coffee maker, not even looking at me as she spoke. Don't be so dramatic. He's just a child playing around. You're making a mountain out of a molehill. She measured coffee grounds with deliberate slowness, her back to me, as if this conversation was already boring her. You found the keys, didn't you? So what's the problem? You still have plenty of time. The casual dismissal hit me like a physical blow. I actually felt my knees weaken, felt something fundamental shift in my chest. Mom, he said Alison told him to do it. This wasn't an accident. She deliberately sabotaged. Alison would never do something like that. My mother finally turned to face me, and her expression was one of mild annoyance mixed with disappointment, as if I was a particularly slow student who kept failing to grasp a simple concept. You're upset and looking for someone to blame. Children take things. They hide things. It's what they do. Ethan is 7 years old. He doesn't understand the importance of adult responsibilities. Getting angry at him isn't going to help anything. I'm not angry at Ethan. The words came out louder than I intended, sharp with desperation. I'm trying to tell you that Alison coached him to do this. He repeated her exact words. She told him I would stay if he kept my keys. How is that just childish mischief? My mother's face hardened. Lower your voice. You're scaring him. She gestured toward Ethan, who had indeed started to look genuinely distressed, though whether from fear or from well-trained performance, I could no longer tell. This is exactly what I'm talking about. You always overreact to everything. You get one little setback and suddenly it's a catastrophe. Do you know how exhausting that is? Your sister has real problems. She's a single mother trying to rebuild her life after a divorce. You have a job, an apartment, no responsibilities except yourself. And you're standing here having a meltdown because a child took your keys for 10 minutes. The comparison landed exactly where it was meant to. My struggles were trivial. Alison's struggles were real. My potential career transformation was one little setback, while Alison's third failed business venture was a tragedy requiring everyone's sympathy and support. The hierarchy was so familiar, so deeply entrenched, that my mother didn't even seem to hear how cruel she sounded. This was just how things were. This was just how things had always been. I looked at Alison, then really looked at her and saw the smile. She tried to hide it, pressing her lips together and arranging her features into an expression of concern, but it was there in her eyes. That glint of triumph. That satisfied gleam that said she'd won again, that she'd successfully manoeuvred everyone into their proper positions with her at the centre, being protected, and me at the periphery being dismissed. It was the same expression I'd seen 1,000 times growing up. When I'd asked why we couldn't go to my piano recital, because Alison had a tummy ache. When I'd questioned why my college graduation gift was a card with $50, while Alison's high school graduation had warranted a car. When I'd wondered aloud why every family gathering had to revolve around Alison's needs and schedule. That smile that said, because I matter and you don't, and everyone here agrees with me. The room fell silent, except for the gurgling of the coffee maker. I stood there with my keys digging into my palm, my interview outfit still hanging upstairs, my carefully prepared notes, sitting on my nightstand, and 28 minutes now lost to this confrontation. 7:43. I could still make it if I ran upstairs, threw on my clothes, and drove faster than I should. I could still salvage this. But something had broken loose inside me, some carefully maintained dam that had been holding back 35 years of accumulated grief and rage and bone-deep exhaustion. Ethan, reading the room with the keen emotional intelligence of a child raised in dysfunction, took a trembling breath and looked up at me with wide liquid eyes. His lip quivered with perfect timing. "Did I do something wrong, Auntie?" he asked in a small wounded voice that suggested I was the monster here, that my anger and hurt were the real problem, that I was the adult terrorizing an innocent child who'd just been playing an innocent game. "I'm sorry if I made you sad. I didn't mean to be bad." And there it was. The final, perfect manipulation. If I said yes, you did something wrong. Your mother told you to sabotage me. I became the villain who couldn't forgive a child's mistake. If I said no, everything's fine, I validated the entire toxic pattern and confirmed that my needs, my career, my one shot at transformation didn't matter enough to warrant even basic acknowledgement of wrongdoing. I was trapped in a narrative where I couldn't win, couldn't even exist as someone with legitimate grievances, because my family had spent 35 years teaching me that my role was to absorb damage silently and call it strength. My mother softened him immediately at Ethan's tears, moving to comfort him with the tenderness she'd never shown me in moments of crisis. "Of course, you didn't do anything wrong, sweetheart. Aunt Catherine is just stressed about her job thing. She's not really mad at you." She stroked his hair and shot me a look that clearly communicated, "See what you've done. See how you've upset this innocent child. This is who you really are." That was the moment I made a decision that would change everything. I didn't say another word. Not to my mother, not to Alison, not to Ethan, who was still performing his trembling lip routine for an audience that had already decided I was the problem. I simply turned and walked up the stairs to my room, each step feeling strangely weightless, as if I detached from my body and was watching myself move through the house from somewhere outside myself. I could hear my mother's voice calling after me, something about not being childish, about coming back to talk this through like adults, but the words reached me as if through water distorted and distant. In my room, I picked up my purse and my phone. That was all. I left my suitcase with its 3 days of carefully packed clothes. I left my interview outfit hanging on the back of the door. I left my toiletries in the bathroom and my laptop with its cracked screen sitting on the nightstand. I took only what I'd walked in with, as if I'd never been there at all, as if I could erase the last 72 hours by leaving no trace of my presence. My hands moved with mechanical precision, unplugged from the chaos of emotion roiling in my chest, and within 90 seconds, I was back downstairs. My mother was waiting at the bottom of the staircase, blocking my path with her body arms crossed in that universal, maternal stance of forced confrontation. "Where do you think you're going? We need to discuss this. You can't just storm off every time things don't go your way. That's not how families work." Her voice carried that particular tone of righteous frustration, the voice of someone who believes they're being perfectly reasonable while you're being impossibly difficult. I looked at her and felt nothing. That was the strangest part. No anger, no hurt, no desperate need for her to understand or apologize or acknowledge what had just happened. Just a vast, echoing emptiness where all my hope had lived for 35 years. "I'm going to my interview," I said quietly and walked past her toward the front door. She didn't try to physically stop me, just made a sound of exasperation and called after me about being dramatic, about how I'd regret this later, about how I was embarrassing myself. I stood on the front porch in the early morning sunlight and pulled up a taxi app on my phone. 12 minutes away. I could have taken my car. I had the keys now clutched in my hand, but some instinct told me not to. Taking my car meant potentially coming back for my things, meant leaving a thread connecting me to this place and these people. The taxi was clean. The taxi was final. I sat down on the porch steps and waited, watching the small animated car icon inch closer on my phone screen while my childhood home loomed behind me, full of people who would be discussing my unreasonable behaviour, my overreaction, my dramatic exits. Let them. The taxi pulled up at 8 o'clock exactly. I stood, walked to the car and got in without looking back at the house. The driver, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and elaborate braids, glanced at me in the rearview mirror. "Morning. Where to?" I gave her the address of Morrison Garrett Corporation, and she pulled away from the curb. Only then did I allow myself to look back through the rear window. My mother had come out onto the porch and was standing there watching the taxi disappear, her face pinched with what might have been concern or might have been annoyance. I couldn't tell anymore. I wasn't sure I'd ever been able to tell. As the familiar streets of my childhood neighbourhood gave way to the highway, I caught sight of my reflection in the taxi window. My face looked strange to me, pale and hollow-eyed, older than 35. I stared at that reflection and felt something crack open in my chest, not dramatically, but quietly, like ice breaking on a spring lake. The thoughts came in clear, complete sentences, as if someone else was speaking them directly into my mind. For decades, I chose silence, thinking it was maturity, thinking it made me the bigger person, thinking it proved I was strong enough not to need what everyone else seemed to need so desperately. But I was really just terrified that if I spoke up, if I demanded to be seen and valued, Mum would choose Alison anyway, and I'd have to face that truth. I'd have to admit that I was never going to be enough, was never going to earn the love I'd been chasing my whole life. Today, I stopped running from that truth. The taxi driver had soft jazz playing on the radio. Outside the window, the city was waking up people heading to work, living their normal Tuesday lives, completely unaware that my entire world had just rearranged itself. I pulled out my phone and opened a new message to my mother. My thumbs moved across the screen, typing words. I'd never had the courage to say out loud, "Mum, I spent 30 years trying to be the invisible daughter to keep our family peaceful." I compressed myself into smaller and smaller spaces, told myself I was being mature and understanding. But I realise now, peace built on my silence, and sacrifice isn't peace at all. It's just slow suffocation dressed up as a family loyalty. I'm done suffocating. I read it over 3 times, feeling each word resonate in my bones like a tuning fork. Then, I deleted it without sending it. Not because I didn't mean it, but because I finally understood that she would never hear it. You can't explain yourself to people who've already decided you don't matter. You can only stop needing them to understand. The taxi merged onto the highway, putting miles between me and the house where I'd grown up, the house where I'd learned to disappear. I felt something unfamiliar stirring beneath the hurt and anger, something that might have been determination, or might have been the first shoots of self-respect breaking through frozen ground. I would never again shrink myself to fit into spaces that were too small for my worth, even if those spaces were called family. I would never again prioritize other people's comfort over my own survival. I would never again accept "that's just how things are" as an excuse for being treated as less than I deserved. These weren't dramatic proclamations. They were quiet, bone-deep certainties settling into place like sediment after a storm. The interview was at 9 o'clock. It was now 8:27. I would be late, but I would be there. But fate had a different plan waiting for me at that interview. The taxi pulled up to Morrison Garrett Corporation at 9:42. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the sleek glass building, I could see the reception area with its minimalist furniture and carefully curated corporate art. This was supposed to be my moment of transformation, the interview I'd prepared for, obsessively the opportunity that would validate decades of invisible effort. Instead, I was 42 minutes late, wearing jeans and a wrinkled blouse I'd slept in, carrying no portfolio or resume copies, looking like someone who'd just crawled out of a personal disaster, which I supposed I had. I could have turned around, I could have called from the taxi and claimed a family emergency rescheduled, shown up next week, prepared and polished and on time. But something had shifted in me during that silent taxi ride, some fundamental recalibration of what mattered and what didn't. I paid the driver, thanked her, and walked through those glass doors, with my purse clutched in one hand, and the truth clutched somewhere deeper, ready to speak it, regardless of consequences. The receptionist's expression cycled through confusion, concern, and professional courtesy as I approached her desk. "I'm Catherine Lewis. I had a 9 o'clock interview with Mr. Morrison. I know I'm very late." My voice sounded steadier than I felt. She made a phone call, spoke in low tones, and then directed me to the third floor with the kind of careful politeness people use when they're not sure if you're about to fall apart in their lobby. Robert Morrison's office was at the end of a hushed corridor, lined with awards and company milestone photos. His assistant, a woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, looked me over with an expression that suggested she'd already written me off. Mr. Morrison is still willing to see you, though we did have another candidate scheduled for this time. Please, wait here. She gestured to a chair outside his office, and I sat, my heart hammering, not with hope, but with a strange, detached curiosity about what would happen next. I'd already lost everything that morning. What was one more rejection? When the door opened, I expected a brief, polite dismissal. Instead, Robert Morrison stood there tall, maybe 60, with steel grey hair and the kind of face that suggested he'd seen enough of life not to be easily shocked. "Ms. Lewis, please come in." His voice was neutral, revealing nothing. I walked into his office, which was surprisingly warm despite its corporate setting, filled with books and family photos, alongside the expected diplomas and achievement plaques. He gestured to a chair across from his desk and sat down, studying me with frank curiosity. "You're 45 minutes late to what I assume you knew was an important interview. You're not dressed in business attire. You arrived without materials or portfolio. And yet, you're here. I'm genuinely curious about your story, Ms. Lewis, because in 30 years of conducting interviews, this is memorable." The old Catherine would have scrambled to craft an excuse, would have apologised profusely, while minimising the situation, would have tried to redirect attention to her qualifications, while glossing over the obvious disaster. But that Catherine had gotten out of a taxi somewhere back on the highway. The person sitting in this chair had nothing left to lose, and nothing left to prove. So I told the truth. My car keys were hidden by my nephew this morning. I discovered this while trying to leave for our interview. When I attempted to address the situation with my family, I was told I was overreacting and making a mountain out of a molehill. I realised I had a choice: stay and argue about whether my career opportunity mattered, or leave and prioritise that opportunity myself. I took a taxi the moment I had my keys back. I apologise for my lateness. My commitment to this position remains unchanged, though I understand if you've moved on to other candidates. I said it calmly, without drama, without trying to elicit sympathy or justify myself beyond the facts. It was simply what had happened, delivered with the exhausted honesty of someone who'd run out of energy for performance. Morrison's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, interest maybe, or recognition of something he hadn't expected to find. "That must have been difficult," he said after a moment. Not just the practical logistics, but the family dynamic that would create such a situation on such an important day. It wasn't a question, just an observation, and the lack of judgment in his voice nearly undid me. I nodded, not trusting myself to elaborate without falling apart. What happened next surprised me. He didn't end the interview. Instead, he asked me substantive questions about leadership philosophy, about how I'd handled difficult employee situations, about my vision for talent development. We talked for 45 minutes, and somewhere in that conversation, I forgot I was supposed to be performing. I just spoke honestly about my experience, about what I'd learned from years of being undervalued, and how that had taught me to see people others overlooked, about how the best leaders were often those who'd had to fight for their own recognition, and therefore never took anyone's contributions for granted. Morrison listened with complete attention, asking follow-up questions that suggested he was actually hearing what I said rather than checking boxes on an evaluation form. When I finished answering his question about building inclusive team cultures, he leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment, studying me with that same frank curiosity. "Ms. Lewis, I'm going to be direct with you. This particular position isn't right for your timeline. It requires immediate start, and frankly, based on what you've told me about your morning, you need some time to sort out your personal situation." My heart sank, but he held up a hand. "However, I'm launching a management training program at our parent company. It's highly competitive, starts in 6 weeks, and it's designed to accelerate high-potential candidates into leadership roles. The program typically takes someone from mid-level to senior management in about 3 years instead of 7. I think you'd be an excellent fit if you're interested. I stared at him, certain I'd misheard. I don't understand. I showed up late and unprepared to this interview. You showed up, he said simply. After what sounds like a deliberately sabotaged morning, you still prioritized being here. And when I asked why you didn't make excuses or play victim, you stated facts and moved forward. That's the kind of resilience we need in leadership. That's grace under pressure, Ms. Lewis. You can teach someone technical skills. You can't teach character. He slid a folder across the desk. Application materials. The program is rigorous, but I think you're ready for rigorous. I took the folder with shaking hands, still half convinced this was some elaborate corporate politeness before rejection. Thank you. I don't know what to say. Say you'll consider it carefully. And, Ms. Lewis. He stood, extending his hand. Whatever you decide about the program, I hope you'll also decide that you deserve better than people who hide your car keys. You showed up for yourself today. Keep doing that. I shook his hand and left his office in a daze, clutching the folder like a life preserver. In the elevator, down to the lobby, I finally let myself cry, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming strangeness of being seen, truly seen, by someone who had no reason to look that closely. I had no idea that this man would become the mentor who'd transform my entire life. Robert Morrison became exactly what he'd promised, to be a mentor who saw potential where others saw only credentials. The management training program started 6 weeks after that disastrous interview morning, and I threw myself into it with the intensity of someone who'd finally found solid ground after 35 years of quicksand. The program was rigorous in ways I hadn't anticipated, not just learning systems and protocols, but being systematically broken down and rebuilt as a leader. They taught us to make decisions without perfect information, to have difficult conversations, without flinching to advocate for ourselves and our teams, with the kind of confidence I'd spent my whole life believing I didn't deserve. I was 36 years old and learning for the first time that my voice had value, that disagreement wasn't betrayal, that taking up space wasn't selfishness. At night, after 12-hour days, I studied employment law through online courses, not because it was required, but because I was hungry for knowledge that would make me undeniable. I wanted to be so competent that no one could dismiss me with a casual wave of their hand. I volunteered for the employee relations cases everyone else avoided: the workplace conflicts, the discrimination complaints, the terminations that required both legal precision and human compassion. I built a reputation as someone who could handle the difficult conversations, who could find solutions in situations others had written off as unsolvable. By my second year, I'd been promoted to senior HR specialist with a small team of my own. That's when I met Sarah Chen. She was 32, whip-smart with a dry sense of humour that surfaced at unexpected moments. We were paired together on a complex restructuring project, spending long hours reviewing employee files and designing transition support programs. Somewhere around week 3 over takeout Chinese food at 9 p.m. in the conference room, the professional walls came down. I don't remember exactly how it started. Probably I made some offhand comment about family obligations about not going home for holidays. Sarah looked up from her lo mein and said quietly, "I haven't been home in 8 years." Something in her tone made me pause, made me recognise a familiar pain underneath the casual statement. And so I told her. Not everything, but fragments. The invisible achievements, the systematic dismissal, the morning with the car keys that had finally broken something open in me. Sarah listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said simply, "I understand that feeling. I also have a sister." She trailed off, her eyes distant, and didn't complete the thought. But she didn't need to. That unfinished sentence held everything. The grief, the anger, the complicated love for people who'd hurt you, the exhaustion of always being the strong one who didn't need anything. We sat in silence for a moment, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years, the relief of being understood without having to explain or justify myself. After that, Sarah became more than a colleague. She became the sister I'd never had, the one I chose rather than the one assigned to me by blood. We celebrated each other's wins, covered each other during rough patches, spoke honestly without the minefield of family dynamics, turning every conversation into a negotiation. She never pushed me to reconcile with my family, never suggested that time would heal wounds or that I was being too harsh. She simply existed as proof that you could build meaningful connections with people who actually saw you. Meanwhile, I made a deliberate choice about my family complete strategic silence. I didn't return my mother's calls, which had started about 2 weeks after I left and continued sporadically for months, voicemails that cycled through confusion, annoyance, guilt-tripping, and eventually hurt feelings about my abandonment. I didn't go home for Thanksgiving or Christmas. I didn't announce my promotions or share my achievements. I stayed off social media entirely, creating a wall of privacy they couldn't penetrate. This wasn't revenge, though. I knew they'd interpret it that way. It was protection. I was building something precious and fragile, a sense of self-worth that wasn't contingent on their approval, and I knew instinctively that exposing it to their toxicity before it was fully formed would destroy it. Sarah and I had lunch one afternoon during my 3rd year at Morris & Garrett, sitting outside near the company's carefully landscaped fountain. I was telling her about Robert Morrison's latest mentorship advice when the memory surfaced unexpectedly. "You know what's strange?" I said more to myself than to her. "That morning when everything happened, the morning with the keys, my mum came downstairs and said she'd seen Ethan holding my keys earlier. But when she said that the keys had already disappeared, I'd already been searching for half an hour. So she didn't see him holding them innocently. She saw him hide them. She watched him take them and said nothing." Sarah stopped mid-bite of her salad, her expression sharpening. "You're sure about the timeline?" "Completely sure. I've replayed that morning 1,000 times. The way she phrased it only makes sense if she witnessed the hiding, not just saw him playing with them beforehand." I shrugged, trying to appear casual about something that still stung. "Doesn't matter now. It's ancient history." But Sarah looked troubled, filing away that information with the careful precision of someone who understood that details like that mattered, that they revealed character in ways that couldn't be unseen. "If you ever need to remember exactly what happened that day," she said slowly, "you've got a witness now. Me. I'll remember this conversation." I smiled at her, grateful for the solidarity, even though I couldn't imagine why I'd ever need that particular memory documented. I'd moved on. I was building a new life. The past was behind me, safely locked away, where it couldn't hurt me anymore. But my family wasn't ready to let me disappear so easily. The first attack came via email on a Tuesday afternoon when I was 39 years old and up for consideration as team lead for employee relations. Our corporate HR department received an anonymous message claiming I'd plagiarized significant portions of a diversity initiative proposal from a former colleague at my previous company. The accusations were detailed enough, citing specific phrases and frameworks to trigger an internal investigation. I was called into a meeting with our chief people officer and asked to provide documentation of my work process, original drafts, anything that could prove authorship. I provided everything they requested, and the investigation cleared me within a week. My proposal had been entirely original, built from research and case studies that were properly cited. But what our IT security team discovered in the process was almost more interesting than the false accusation itself. The anonymous email had originated from an IP address in my hometown sent from a public library computer. They couldn't prove who sent it, but the geographic specificity was damning enough. I knew. Sarah knew, and the sick feeling in my stomach told me this wasn't the end. Sarah wanted me to pursue legal action. "This is defamation, Catherine. You have grounds for a lawsuit. She tried to destroy your career." We were in her office with the door closed, and her face was flushed with protective anger on my behalf. But I'd learned something in my years of building this new life. Sometimes the high road isn't about forgiveness, it's about strategy. "If I sue," I said slowly, working through the logic out loud, "everyone at work learns about my family dysfunction. My professional reputation becomes tangled with this drama. Every future achievement gets an asterisk. She's the one with the crazy sister. My career gets defined by this instead of by my competence." I met Sarah's eyes. "I'll prove my integrity through results instead, but I'm documenting everything. Every email, every false claim, every contact. If she escalates, I'll have a paper trail that shows a pattern." She escalated. Over the next 6 months, the attacks grew bolder and more desperate. Phone calls to my office line claiming to be emergency contacts for family crises that didn't exist. My mother was in the hospital. She wasn't. Alison had been in a car accident. She hadn't. Forcing me to waste time verifying these false alarms, while my colleagues looked on with growing concern. Then, Alison herself showed up in our lobby one Friday afternoon, her voice carrying across the marble atrium as she demanded to see me, claimed I owed her money, made a scene that required security intervention, while my co-workers streamed past on their way to lunch. Each incident was designed to make me look unstable, to suggest I was financially entangled with problematic family members, to plant seeds of doubt about my judgment and reliability. After the lobby incident, my manager called me in for a quiet conversation, not accusatory, but concerned, asking if everything was all right at home, if I needed any resources or support. I explained calmly that I had an estranged family member who was attempting to interfere with my professional life, that I'd already consulted with legal counsel about obtaining a restraining order if the behaviour continued, and that I appreciated the company's patience while I handled this personal matter. The strange thing was that these attacks, rather than breaking me, clarified something essential. I could see now, with perfect clarity, why Alison couldn't let me disappear quietly. My success shattered the family narrative that had sustained her entire identity. She was supposed to be the fragile one who needed protection, and I was supposed to be the strong one who needed nothing, not even love, not even basic recognition. But if I thrived without them, if I built a life where I was valued and respected and seen, it meant the narrative had been a lie all along. It meant she'd been enabled in weakness while I'd been neglected in strength, and that the family hierarchy had been a choice rather than a natural order. She couldn't tolerate my absence because it revealed her own emptiness. And so, she kept reaching out with these desperate, flailing attacks, trying to drag me back into the dysfunction, where she knew how to operate, where she held all the power. But I'd learned to operate in a different world now, one where competence mattered more than manipulation, where boundaries were respected rather than violated. I documented everything, built my case, and kept moving forward. Little did I know, these attacks were just practice for what would happen 3 years later. By year 6, when I was 41, I'd weathered Alison's harassment campaign and emerged with my professional reputation intact. That's when the defining opportunity arrived, leading recruitment strategy for Morris & Garrett's new regional branch. It was a high-visibility project, the kind that would either launch me into senior management or expose me as someone who'd reached her ceiling. I was given a team of 5 people, a tight timeline, and explicit metrics to meet. I threw myself into it with everything I'd learned over the past 6 years. We implemented data-driven hiring processes, built partnerships with local universities for talent pipelines, created structured interview protocols that reduced bias and improved quality of hire. Within 18 months, we'd reduced time to hire by 40%, while simultaneously improving retention rates metrics that made the executive team take notice. I was promoted to HR manager, overseeing a team of 8 people and helping shape policy at the organisational level. What set me apart Robert Morrison told me during my promotion review wasn't just technical competence, it was integrity. He referenced a situation from that year where a C-suite executive had pressured me to bend hiring requirements for his nephew, a young man with minimal qualifications applying for a position that required specific expertise. I documented the request, consulted with legal and compliance, and escalated it appropriately through channels. The executive was quietly reassigned to a different division, and I'd stood firm despite the risk to my own career. What I saw in you that first day was grace under pressure. Morrison said, his 65-year-old face creased with something like pride. These past 7 years have proven I was right. You don't just handle adversity, you metabolize it into wisdom. That's rare, Catherine. That's what we need in leadership. As I approached year 8, approaching my 43rd birthday, and nearly a decade since that morning, I'd walked out of my childhood home. I felt something I'd never experienced before, a sense of earned belonging. This wasn't contingent acceptance or love I had to perform for. This was a professional world where my value wasn't questioned, where my voice mattered in strategy meetings, where my judgment was trusted. I wasn't invisible anymore. I'd become undeniable. And then, in year 8, the opportunity I'd been building toward finally arrived. The opportunity arrived in the form of a retirement and a restructuring. Our director of recruitment, a woman who'd held the position for 15 years, announced her departure to spend more time with her grandchildren. The executive team conducted a national search, interviewed 8 candidates, and in the end offered the position to me. I was 43 years old and had spent the previous 8 years proving myself in every measurable way. When Robert Morrison called me into his office to extend the offer, he said something I'd carry with me forever. You've earned this 10 times over. The only question is whether you're ready for the weight of it. I was ready. Over the next 2 years, I grew into the role of Director of Recruitment for Morrison Garrett Corporation, overseeing a team of 35 people across 5 regional branches, holding final approval authority for all senior-level hires, shaping organizational culture through the people we brought into the company. It was the kind of position that would have seemed impossible to the 35-year-old version of me, the woman who'd arrived 40 minutes late to an interview in wrinkled clothes, carrying only heartbreak and car keys. Now, at 45, I had an office with windows overlooking the city, my name on the organizational chart 3 levels below the CEO, and the kind of professional respect that felt like solid ground beneath my feet. Sarah had been promoted to senior HR business partner and worked 2 floors below me. We still had lunch together every week, still celebrated each other's wins, still served as witnesses to each other's growth. She'd been right there beside me for this entire journey, and I never took that for granted. The company announced plans in late spring for a major expansion, a 6th regional branch that would serve our fastest-growing market sector. The new office would need a full complement of staff, including several experienced mid-level managers, administrative leaders, and operational specialists. As Director of Recruitment, I'd oversee the entire hiring process, reviewing applications, conducting initial screenings, coordinating with hiring committees, making recommendations for final candidates. We expected hundreds of applications. Every single one would cross my desk at some point in the pipeline. On a Tuesday afternoon in early June, I was working through the latest batch of applications for branch administrative manager, a position requiring 5 years of management experience, demonstrated skills in operations coordination, budget oversight, and team leadership. I'd reviewed maybe 40 applications that week, sorting them into 3 categories: strong candidates for phone screens, possible candidates pending reference checks, and insufficient qualifications. The work was methodical, familiar, almost meditative in its routine. Then I saw the name on application number 43, Alison Lewis. My hand stopped moving. I stared at those 2 words, my sister's name in 12-point Times New Roman font, and felt my heartbeat accelerate in a way that had nothing to do with the present moment, and everything to do with memories I'd carefully archived but never quite deleted. I opened the full application file with hands that had gone slightly numb. The resume was a masterclass, in how to dress up failure in professional language. 7 different jobs over 10 years each, lasting between 8 and 16 months. A small business owner entry that I knew from family gossip had been a failed online boutique selling overpriced accessories. 3 MLM ventures described as independent contractor and marketing consultant positions. Current status unemployed for 6 months. Education associate's degree completed over 12 years with multiple institutional transfers. Skills section, generic buzzwords like team player, detail-oriented, adaptable to change. Nothing concrete, nothing measurable, nothing that actually qualified her for a position managing a team of 15 people with $1 million operational budget. But it was the personal essay portion of the application that nearly made me laugh out loud. Alison had written 3 paragraphs about coming from a family that values discipline, hard work, and supporting each other through challenges, about how her experience navigating difficult family situations had given her unique insight into conflict resolution and building cohesive teams, about her commitment to loyalty and standing by the people who depend on her leadership. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. This was the woman who'd coached her 7-year-old son to hide my car keys on the most important morning of my life. The woman who'd sent anonymous emails trying to get me fired for plagiarism. The woman who'd shown up at my office building demanding money to create a scene in front of my colleagues. And now she was applying to work at my company claiming family values and loyalty as her defining characteristics, apparently believing I wouldn't see the application, or wouldn't remember, or wouldn't care. I sat in my office as afternoon light slanted through the windows, staring at my sister's inadequate resume, and waited for the rage to come, or the satisfaction, or the vindictive joy of having her finally perfectly at my mercy. But none of those feelings arrived. Instead, I felt only a strange, crystalline clarity. This wasn't about revenge. This wasn't even really about Alison. This was about maintaining the professional standards I'd spent 10 years building, about treating every application with the same documented fairness, regardless of personal history. I would handle this exactly as I'd handle any other application from an unqualified candidate. I would note the insufficient experience, the employment gaps, the lack of concrete achievements. I would follow protocol she'd be invited for a standard first-round interview because her basic credentials technically met the bare minimum requirements, even if barely. But that interview would be conducted by a 3-person panel, including myself, Sarah, and a neutral third party. Every question would be documented. Every answer would be evaluated against the same rubric we used for all candidates. There would be no favoritism, no special treatment, and absolutely no personal vendetta, just professional judgment applied consistently. I created her candidate file, noting that the hiring panel should be informed of the familial relationship to ensure documented transparency. I scheduled a preliminary interview for the following Tuesday at 10 a.m. And then I did something I hadn't done in 10 years. I allowed myself to smile. Not from joy, and certainly not from cruelty, but from the quiet realization that after a decade of building myself from nothing, I finally had something they desperately needed: the power to say no. Over the next hour, I read through Alison's application, with the meticulous attention I'd bring to any candidate file, taking notes in the margins and cross-referencing her claims against the position requirements. The deeper I went, the clearer the picture became, and it wasn't flattering. Her employment history was a patchwork of short-term positions that never progressed beyond entry-level responsibilities, despite her attempts to inflate the titles. Sales team leader at a retail store where she'd worked for 11 months, I'd seen enough of these positions to know this likely meant she'd occasionally closed the store and counted the register, not that she'd actually managed anyone. Operations coordinator for 14 months at a medical supply company, a role that typically involved scheduling and data entry, rather than the strategic oversight the title suggested. Independent business owner from 2019 to 2021, this was the online boutique I'd heard about through the family grapevine, the one that had lasted 18 months before, collapsing under inventory debt and Alison's inability to handle customer complaints professionally. Then there were the MLM ventures dressed up as independent marketing consultant and brand ambassador, positions that required no actual qualifications and typically resulted in financial loss rather than gain for the people who signed up for them. I'd reviewed enough applications over the years to recognise the patterns of people who'd been caught in predatory marketing schemes, and I felt a flicker of something that might have been sympathy if it weren't overshadowed by the memory of Alison's deliberate sabotage attempts. The most damning evidence, though, was what wasn't there. No progression, no increasing responsibility, no quantifiable achievements. A branch administrative manager needed to demonstrate budget oversight, team leadership process. Improvement, stakeholder management. Alison's resume showed someone who'd never stayed anywhere long enough to be trusted with real authority, who'd never been promoted, who'd never led a successful project from inception to completion. By any objective standard, she was dramatically underqualified for the position she was pursuing. And yet, she'd applied with what appeared to be complete confidence, as if the rules that applied to other candidates somehow wouldn't apply to her. Perhaps she'd assumed that family connection would work in her favour. Perhaps she'd thought I wouldn't see the application, that it would be screened by someone else who'd pass her through based on surface qualifications. Or perhaps, and this seemed most likely given everything I knew about Alison, she simply believed that things would work out for her the way they always had, that someone would smooth the path and make accommodations and lower the standards because that's what had happened her entire life. The personal essay portion of her application would have been comedic if it weren't so staggeringly lacking in self-awareness. She'd written 3 carefully crafted paragraphs about her strong family values and how growing up in a household that emphasised discipline, hard work, and supporting each other through challenges had shaped her leadership philosophy. She described herself as someone who believed in standing by the people who depend on you and creating environments where everyone feels valued and seen. I read those words twice, then a third time, searching for any hint of irony or self-reflection. There was none. This was the woman who'd weaponized her own child to destroy my career opportunity. The woman who'd sent anonymous accusations to my employer trying to get me fired. The woman who'd shown up at my workplace to create scenes designed to make me look unstable. And she was claiming with apparent sincerity that she valued supporting others and making people feel seen. The cognitive dissonance was either pathological or deliberate manipulation. Possibly both. I made a note in her file about the family relationship disclosure and moved on to the practical decision at hand. Every instinct in my body was screaming to reject this application immediately. She wasn't qualified. She had a documented history of sabotaging me professionally. Allowing her anywhere near my workplace felt like inviting a fox into the henhouse. But I'd spent 10 years building a reputation for integrity, for treating every candidate fairly regardless of personal feelings, for maintaining standards, even when it would be easier to bend them. If I rejected Alison's application without due process, without the standard interview protocol, I would be compromising the very principles that had earned me this position. More than that, I'd be giving her exactly what she'd always gotten: special treatment, based on family connection rather than merit. The only difference would be that this time the special treatment would be negative instead of positive. But special treatment was special treatment, and I'd promised myself I would never be the kind of leader who let personal relationships corrupt professional judgment. So I made the only decision my integrity would allow. I scheduled Alison for a standard first-round panel interview to be conducted by myself, Sarah Chen, and David Park, our Vice President of Operations, who had no connection to my personal history and could serve as a neutral evaluator. The interview would be documented, recorded, and assessed against the same competency rubric we used for every branch administrative manager candidate. She would get exactly what every other applicant got: a fair hearing and an evaluation based solely on her qualifications. What I didn't do was inform her in advance that I would be conducting the interview. This wasn't an oversight, and it wasn't revenge. Standard protocol was that candidates didn't receive interviewer names beforehand. We'd learned years ago that advance notice gave candidates time to research their interviewers and tailor responses in ways that felt more like performance than authentic conversation. Some companies shared panel composition in advance. We'd deliberately chosen not to. Giving Alison special warning would be exactly the kind of favoritism I'd spent my career avoiding. The email went out through our automated system. Dear Ms. Lewis, thank you for your application for Branch Administrative Manager. We'd like to invite you to a first-round interview on Tuesday, June 15th at 10:00 a.m. at our corporate headquarters. Please arrive 15 minutes early to complete preliminary paperwork. The interview will be conducted by a 3-person panel and is expected to last approximately 1 hour. We look forward to speaking with you. Professional, neutral, standard. I copied Sarah on the interview calendar invitation and sent her a brief message. Familial relationship disclosed to panel. Proceed with standard protocol. No accommodations. Her response came back within minutes. Understood. I'll be there. I closed Alison's application file and turned to the remaining 40 applications waiting for review, forcing myself to give each one the same careful attention I'd given my sisters. But as I worked through the stack, I felt something building in my chest that I hadn't allowed myself to feel in 10 years. Not anticipation exactly, but a sense of readiness. A sense that the universe had spent a decade preparing me for this exact moment. I prepared for a reunion 10 years in the making, one where I would finally hold all the cards. Tuesday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline June clarity that felt almost symbolic. No clouds, no ambiguity, just sharp sunlight cutting through the floor-to-ceiling windows of our corporate lobby. I arrived at my office at 7:30, 2.5 hours before Alison's scheduled interview, and spent the time reviewing her application one final time, while drinking coffee that had gone cold without me noticing. Sarah knocked on my door at 8:45, carrying 2 folders and wearing an expression of quiet solidarity. "Ready?" she asked, settling into the chair across from my desk. "As ready as I'll ever be for something like this," I admitted. "David will meet us in conference room C at 9:50. Standard protocol, standard questions, standard evaluation rubric. We treat this exactly like any other interview." "Except it's not any other interview," Sarah said gently. "And that's okay to acknowledge, at least between us. You don't have to pretend this doesn't matter." I nodded, grateful for her understanding while also needing to compartmentalize the emotion threatening to surface. It matters, but it can't affect my professional judgment. Those two things have to stay separate. At 9:50, we gathered in conference room C, a space deliberately chosen for its neutrality, with a long table, comfortable chairs, and recording equipment mounted discreetly in the ceiling corners for documentation purposes. David Park arrived precisely on time, a silver-haired man in his late 50s who'd been with the company for 20 years and had a reputation for fairness that bordered on legendary. I'd briefed him earlier about the familial relationship, and he'd simply nodded and said, "Then we make sure everything's documented. Standard protocol protects everyone." My desk phone buzzed at 9:55 with a message from our receptionist, Melissa. "Ms. Lewis and her mother have arrived for the 10 a.m. interview. Also, you should know I overheard Ms. Lewis offering me cash to just peek at the interview questions for a few seconds." I declined and documented the incident per protocol. Report filed with HR.
Sure.
I felt Sarah stiffen beside me as I read the message aloud to the panel. David's expression darkened. "That's an immediate ethics violation," he said quietly. "Attempting to bribe staff for confidential information." That alone would typically disqualify a candidate regardless of interview performance. Noted and documented. I said, my voice steady despite the sick feeling in my stomach. 10 years hadn't changed Alison at all. She was still looking for shortcuts, still trying to manipulate systems, still assuming rules didn't apply to her. But we'll proceed with the interview as scheduled. She deserves to be evaluated on the full scope of her conduct, not just one incident. At exactly 10 o'clock, Melissa escorted them to conference room C. Them. I'd been expecting Alison had steeled myself for seeing my sister after a decade of silence. But when the door opened, my mother walked in right behind her, and for a moment my carefully constructed professional composure cracked just slightly. She was 70 now, smaller than I remembered, her hair fully grey and cut shorter than she used to wear it. She was dressed in what I recognised as her church clothes, the navy blue suit she reserved for occasions she deemed important, and her presence here was clearly meant as backup, as moral support, as a silent statement that family solidarity demanded my cooperation. Alison had dressed for the interview in what she probably thought looked like executive attire, a designer-labelled blazer that I suspected had been purchased specifically for this occasion, paired with accessories meant to project success she didn't have. She looked older than 45, stress and disappointment etched into lines around her mouth and eyes. When she saw me sitting at the head of the conference table, her expression cycled through emotions so quickly, it was almost comical shock that blanked her face completely. Disbelief that widened her eyes, panic that tightened her jaw, and finally a forced composure that settled over her features, like an ill-fitting mask. My mother's reaction was less controlled. She stopped mid-step and audibly gasped. "What are you doing here?" The question came out sharp with accusation, as if I was the one who'd shown up somewhere I didn't belong, rather than sitting in my own company's conference room conducting an interview I'd been assigned. I stood gesturing to the chairs across from our panel. "Good morning. Please have a seat." My voice came out level professional, giving away nothing of the emotional earthquake happening beneath my surface calm. "I'm Catherine Lewis, Director of Recruitment for Morris & Garrett Corporation. This is Sarah Chen, Senior HR Business Partner, and David Park, Vice President of Operations. We'll be conducting your interview today for the Branch Administrative Manager position." Alison remained frozen in the doorway, her face cycling back toward panic as the implications sank in. My mother's hand went to her throat in that gesture of distress I remembered from childhood, and she opened her mouth as if to speak, but I continued before she could interrupt. "The company is aware of our familial relationship, which is why we've assembled a 3-person panel to ensure documented neutrality and fairness. All hiring decisions will be made by committee vote, not by any single individual. Every aspect of this interview will be recorded and evaluated against the same competency rubric we use for all candidates at this level." I paused, meeting Alison's eyes directly. "Do you wish to continue with the interview?" For a moment I thought she might bolt. Her body actually swayed slightly toward the door, her fight or flight instinct clearly screaming at her to run. But she was also 45 years old, unemployed for 6 months, desperate enough to apply for a job where I might see her application. She had no other options, and we both knew it. She took a breath, glanced at our mother for support, and then recovered with the kind of pivot I'd seen her execute 1,000 times growing up. "This isn't appropriate," she said, her voice low and urgent, leaning across the table, as if sharing a confidence rather than making an accusation. "You can't interview your own sister. That's a conflict of interest. Everyone here should know about our complicated family history before we proceed. There are things that would make this very uncomfortable for you professionally if they came out in this setting. The threat was thinly veiled cooperate, or I'll create a scene that damages your reputation in front of your colleagues." Sarah shifted almost imperceptibly beside me, her body language tightening with protective anger. David's expression remained neutral, but his eyes sharpened with interest as he recognised the attempted manipulation for what it was. I felt a strange calm settle over me, the kind that comes when you've been preparing for a moment your entire life, and it finally arrives exactly as you had imagined it. I looked at my sister and said 5 words that would define the next hour. Let's begin with your qualifications. I opened the candidate evaluation form on my tablet and began with the most fundamental question on our management assessment rubric. Ms. Lewis, this position requires supervision of a team of 15 people across multiple functional areas. Please describe your experience managing a team of 5 or more employees, including specific examples of how you've handled performance management, conflict resolution, and professional development. Alison straightened in her chair, and I watched her shift into the performance mode I recognized from childhood. The bright smile, the confident nod, the body language that projected competence whether or not competence actually existed. Well, I've always been very focused on creating collaborative team environments where everyone feels valued and heard. I believe in thinking outside the box when it comes to leadership, really empowering people to bring their authentic selves to work and contribute their unique perspectives. My approach is very relationship-focused, building those personal connections that help teams thrive. Sarah was taking notes, her pen moving across the evaluation form. I waited for Alison to provide an actual example or concrete situation, anything specific. She didn't. She'd used approximately 70 words to say absolutely nothing. David cleared his throat gently, the kind of prompt that signals to a candidate they need to elaborate. Can you give us a specific example? I asked, keeping my voice neutral. A time when you managed a team through a particular challenge with details about the situation, your actions, and the outcome. Alison's smile flickered slightly. Well, there were many times, obviously. At the medical supply company, I was very involved in coordinating the team's activities and making sure everyone was on the same page with their tasks and responsibilities. I facilitated a lot of communication and problem solving. How many direct reports did you have in that role? David asked, his pen poised above his own evaluation form. It was more of a collaborative structure, Alison said, the smile now definitely strained. I worked with about 7 or 8 people in the operations area coordinating activities, making sure things ran smoothly, which meant she'd had 0 direct reports and had been a peer coordinator, at best I translated mentally. I moved to the next standard question. Walk us through how you would handle an underperforming employee. Specifically, what steps would you take? What documentation would you maintain? And how would you balance support with accountability? This time, Alison didn't even attempt a direct answer. She pivoted immediately to generalities about creating supportive environments and understanding that everyone has difficult seasons and approaching people with compassion and flexibility. Sarah's pen had stopped moving. There was nothing concrete enough to document. David was watching Alison with an expression that had shifted from neutral to vaguely concerned, the look of someone witnessing a car accident in slow motion. Our mother, who'd been sitting rigid and silent beside Alison, suddenly leaned forward. You have to understand, my daughter is very capable. She just doesn't interview well. She needs the right opportunity to show what she can do. And family should help family. That's what family means. Her voice carried that same tone of righteous expectation I remembered from childhood, the assumption that stating how things should be would make them so. Sarah and David exchanged a glance, brief, professionally subtle, but loaded with meaning. This kind of parental intervention in an adult's job interview was so far outside professional norms that it bordered on disqualifying by itself. I maintained my neutral expression, made a note on my tablet, and continued with the next question, as if our mother hadn't spoken. Letting the inappropriateness speak for itself was more powerful than any response I could give. But I could feel the energy in the room shifting, feel Alison beginning to panic as she realised that her standard tactics weren't working, that buzzwords and vague platitudes weren't going to carry her through this interview. After 20 minutes of increasingly desperate non-answers, she abruptly changed strategies. She leaned forward, and I watched tears begin to form in her eyes with the practiced ease of someone who'd learned long ago that crying could derail difficult conversations. "You know what I've been through, Catherine?" she said, her voice breaking just slightly on my name. "The divorce, the business failures, the years of struggling to keep Ethan fed and housed while his father sent nothing. I thought family was supposed to support each other during hard times. I thought sisters were supposed to help each other. Is this really how you're going to treat me after everything? What would Dad think if he could see you now, sitting there so cold and professional while I'm drowning? The invocation of our deceased father, who died 8 years ago from a heart attack, and whom I'd learned about 3 weeks after the fact through a cousin's Facebook post, was calculated to wound. It was also completely manipulative, leveraging guilt and family obligation to override professional standards. I felt Sarah tense beside me, felt David shift uncomfortably, but I'd been preparing for exactly this kind of emotional ambush. Before I could formulate a response that maintained professional boundaries while not engaging with the manipulation, there was a knock on the conference room door. Sarah rose to answer it, and through the opening I saw a young man in the hallway, tall, maybe 17, with Alison's eyes and a face I recognised, even though it had been shaped by 10 years of growth I hadn't witnessed. Ethan peeked into the room, his gaze scanning the faces until it landed on mine, and his eyes widened with recognition and something that looked like relief mixed with apprehension. "Aunt Catherine, is that you? I've wanted to talk to you for so long." His voice cracked, slightly adolescent uncertainty breaking through. "Are you still mad at me about the keys?" The question landed in the conference room like a grenade with the pin pulled. Alison's face went from tear-stained manipulation to pure panic in the span of a heartbeat. She lunged half out of her chair, reaching toward Ethan. "Ethan, get back to the lobby right now. This is a private meeting. You shouldn't be here." But Ethan didn't move, his eyes still locked on mine, and I saw in his 17-year-old face a desperate need for something, absolution maybe, or understanding, or just the chance to speak a truth he'd been carrying for a decade. And I realised that this moment, this unexpected collision of past and present, was going to force into the open everything that Alison had tried to bury, everything my mother had tried to ignore, everything I'd spent 10 years building a life around. Before Alison could drag him away, I asked the question that would unravel everything. "Ethan, why did you hide those keys 10 years ago?" The conference room fell into a silence so complete I could hear the ventilation system humming in the ceiling. Ethan stood in the doorway, 17 years old, and caught between childhood loyalty and adult understanding, his face working through emotions he didn't have the sophistication to hide. When he spoke, his voice carried the raw honesty of someone who'd been carrying a weight too heavy for too long and had finally found someone willing to help him set it down. "Mom told me that if you went to that interview, you'd get a job far away and leave us forever." The words came out in a rush, like he'd been rehearsing them for years and needed to say them all before he lost his nerve. "She said you'd move to another state, maybe even another country, and we'd never see you again. She said you'd forget about us, forget about me. She said the only way to keep our family together was to make sure you missed the interview." He looked directly at me, his eyes so like Alison's, but somehow clearer, less calculated, searching my face for something I wasn't sure I could give him. "I was 7. I didn't want you to leave. I thought I was helping." Alison's face drained of colour so quickly I thought she might faint. She shot up from her chair, her hands reaching toward Ethan in a gesture that was half plea, half threat. "Ethan, you're remembering wrong. You're confused. You were just 7 years old children that age, mix up stories, confuse dreams with reality. You don't know what actually happened." But her voice was shaking, climbing higher with each word, and the panic in it betrayed everything she was trying to deny. Her eyes darted frantically between me and the 2 witnesses sitting beside me, Sarah and David, both of whom were documenting every word of this confession. I could see her calculating in real time, trying to figure out how to contain this explosion, how to stuff the truth back into the box where she'd kept it locked for a decade. But Ethan wasn't finished. He'd started speaking, and something in him, maybe the same thing, that had driven me to finally walk away 10 years ago, wouldn't let him stop now. "I'm not confused, Mom." His voice cracked, slightly adolescent uncertainty breaking through, but there was steel underneath it. "I've had 10 years to think about that morning. I remember exactly what you said, exactly what you told me to do. You said, if Aunt Catherine leaves for that interview, she'll never come back. She'll forget all about us. Do you want her to leave forever?" And I said no because I was scared. Dad had already left. I thought if you and Grandma and Aunt Catherine all left too, I'd be completely alone. He took a shuddering breath, and I watched him struggle to articulate something he'd probably only recently come to understand himself. "I didn't realise until I was older what you'd actually done. You were lonely after Dad left. Grandma was there, but you needed Aunt Catherine too, needed her to stay in the family where you could reach her. But you also needed her to fail because if she succeeded and left, you'd have to face everything without her. So you made me the weapon because you knew she wouldn't get really angry at a 7-year-old kid. You used my fear of abandonment to make me sabotage the person who'd never abandoned anyone." The words hung in the air like an indictment, and I watched my sister realise that her son, the child she'd weaponised, the little boy who'd done her bidding without understanding the cruelty of it, had grown into someone capable of seeing her clearly. And he wasn't looking at her with hatred or even anger. He was looking at her with a kind of sad, tired understanding that was somehow worse than any accusation could have been. "I've wanted to apologise to you for 10 years, Ethan said, turning back to me. "I've wanted to tell you I was sorry that I didn't understand, that if I'd known what it would cost you, I never would have done it, but I didn't know how to find you. And Mom said we should leave you alone, that you'd made your choice and we had to respect it. I didn't know you were here. I didn't know this was your company. When I saw you walk in, I thought maybe it was a sign that I could finally say I'm sorry." I sat perfectly still, my hands folded on the table in front of me, my face betraying nothing of the emotional earthquake happening beneath my professional composure. This was confirmation of everything I'd suspected. Alison had deliberately destroyed my opportunity, had coached a child to be her instrument, had played victim while orchestrating sabotage. She'd used her own son's abandonment trauma as a manipulation tool, and she'd done it so effectively that even now, 10 years later, she'd almost convinced him his memory was wrong. But I'd also spent 10 years learning to metabolize pain into wisdom, to process betrayal without letting it poison me. I looked at Ethan, this 17-year-old kid, who'd been used as a pawn in an adult conflict, and who'd spent a decade carrying guilt that was never really his to carry, and I felt something that surprised me. Not anger at him, not even residual hurt, just a recognition that he'd been another casualty of the same family dysfunction that had damaged me, that he'd been weaponized and then abandoned to deal with the consequences alone. "Thank you for your honesty, Ethan," I said quietly, and I meant it. That took courage. My voice was steady, professional, giving away nothing of what I was feeling. "What happened that morning wasn't your fault. You were 7 years old. The adults in the situation bear the responsibility for what happened, not you." The relief that washed over his face was so profound it was almost painful to witness. He'd been carrying this for 10 years, and in 30 seconds I'd given him what no one else had apparently thought to give him absolution from a guilt that had never been his to bear. Then, Alison made the mistake of looking at our mother for support, that old instinct to appeal to the person who'd always protected her, always smoothed the path, always made accommodations so Alison wouldn't have to face consequences. And I saw something in Mum's face that shattered my last illusion. My mother's face in that moment was a study in panic, barely contained, her eyes wide, her mouth opening as if to speak words she'd rehearsed, her hands clutching the edge of the conference table with white-knuckled intensity. She began speaking before Alison could the words tumbling out in that tone of maternal defense I recognized from 35 years of hearing it weaponized on my sister's behalf. "Alison, you promised her you wouldn't..." She stopped mid-sentence, her hand flying to her mouth as she realized what she had just said, what she had just revealed. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah's pen froze mid-stroke on her evaluation form. David's expression shifted from professional neutrality to something sharper, more alert. Ethan's face crumpled with confusion and dawning horror as he processed what his grandmother had just inadvertently confessed. This wasn't news to her. She'd known, not suspected, not wondered known, and she'd promised Alison to keep the secret. I felt something click into place in my mind. A puzzle piece I'd been holding for 10 years is suddenly finding its slot in the larger picture. The memory Sarah had helped me document the detail I'd mentioned casually over lunch years ago came flooding back with crystalline clarity. I spoke with a calm that felt almost surreal given the magnitude of what I was about to articulate. "That morning you told me you saw Ethan holding my keys," I said, looking directly at my mother, my voice quiet but carrying perfectly in the silent room. "You came downstairs after I'd been searching for half an hour. You said, 'I saw Ethan holding your keys this morning.' But when you said that the keys had already been hidden, they were already gone. I'd already torn through the house looking for them." I paused, letting the timeline sink in. "You didn't see him holding them innocently. You saw him hide them. You watched it happen and did nothing." I let that statement hang in the air for a beat before adding the question that would destroy whatever remained of my childhood illusions. "Or did you help plan it?" My mother's face underwent a transformation I'd never seen before, the scaffolding of her defenses collapsing in real time, leaving behind something raw and exposed and terrible to witness. She aged a decade in the space of 10 seconds, her shoulders curving inward, her mouth working soundlessly as she tried to find words that could somehow make this better, could somehow reframe what she'd done into something defensible. "I didn't plan it," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "I overheard Alison on the phone the night before. She was talking to someone I don't know who about making sure you didn't leave, about how if you went to that interview and got the job, you'd move away and never come back. I heard her working out the details about having Ethan hide the keys, about timing it so you'd be too late. And you did nothing," I said. Not a question, a statement. "I didn't know what to do," she said, and now tears were forming in her eyes, the kind of tears that felt more like self-pity than genuine remorse. "I lay awake all night thinking about it. I knew I should stop her, should tell you, should do something. But I was terrified. If you left and never came back, Alison would fall apart completely. You know how she is, how fragile she's always been. Without you, as a buffer, I'd have to deal with her falling apart alone. And you'd be gone, and I'd lose both my daughters." The confession hung in the air like toxic gas. Sarah had abandoned all pretense of documenting the interview and was simply staring at my mother with something approaching horror. David's face had gone carefully blank, the expression of someone witnessing something so far outside professional norms that he wasn't sure how to process it. Ethan looked like he might be sick. "So, you chose to sacrifice me to keep Alison stable?" I said, my voice still eerily calm, despite the screaming that was happening somewhere deep inside my chest. "You chose to let her destroy my opportunity, the most important opportunity I'd had in years, because my strength meant I could handle the loss, while her weakness meant she had to be protected. You made that calculation in one night, lying awake in your bed, and you decided I was acceptable collateral damage." "I didn't think of it that way," my mother protested weakly. "I thought you'd reschedule the interview. I thought it would just be a delay, not the complete destruction of my chance, not the catalyst for me leaving and never coming back, not the final confirmation that I would never matter as much as Alison in your eyes." The words came out precise and surgical, each one chosen to cut. "You didn't think I'd leave permanently because you couldn't imagine I'd have the strength to walk away from people who'd made it clear I was expendable. You miscalculated. You thought I needed you too much to survive on my own. My mother was crying openly now, and I felt nothing watching her tears. No satisfaction, no vindication, just a vast, echoing emptiness where my last hopes for maternal love had been stored. Alison had gone completely still. Her earlier panic replaced by a kind of frozen horror as she watched the family mythology dismantle itself in real time. Even she hadn't realised, I think, the full extent of our mother's complicity. Even she had believed that Mum's dismissal of my pain that morning had been ignorance rather than choice. "I'm sorry," my mother whispered. "I'm so sorry. I thought I was keeping the family together." "No," I said quietly. "You thought you were keeping Alison comfortable. There's a difference. You've always known there's a difference. You just decided one daughter's comfort was worth more than the other daughter's entire future." The silence that followed was so profound I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. I looked around the conference room at Sarah, whose eyes were bright with tears she was too professional to shed in this setting. At David, whose face reflected a kind of appalled understanding that this was no longer a job interview, but a family implosion he'd been caught in the middle of. At Ethan, who looked like he was re-evaluating every assumption he'd ever made about the adults in his life. At Alison, who'd finally stopped trying to control the narrative and was simply drowning in the consequences of her own actions. At my mother, who'd spent 35 years protecting the wrong daughter and had just realised the price of that choice. For the first time in 35 years, I was going to say exactly what I'd always been too afraid to speak out loud. I took a breath and felt 10 years of silence transform into something I could finally speak aloud. When I began, my voice wasn't shaking with rage or trembling with hurt. It was steady, clear, carrying the kind of certainty that comes only from distance and hard-won healing. That morning, 10 years ago, I sat in a taxi driving away from your house, and I believed I'd lost everything. I looked at my mother as I spoke, then at Alison, then let my gaze settle somewhere in the middle distance, where I could see them both without having to meet their eyes directly. The interview. My chance, my family. I cried for 3 hours. I cried so hard the taxi driver asked if I needed her to pull over if there was someone she should call, but then something unexpected happened. I stopped crying and started building. Sarah shifted almost imperceptibly beside me, and I could feel her quiet solidarity without having to look at her. David had his pen poised above his evaluation form, though we'd long since abandoned any pretense that this was still a job interview. This was something else entirely, a reckoning that had been building for 35 years. For years after I left, I thought that someday I'd face you both and feel triumphant, I continued. I imagined this moment. Imagined you seeing what I'd become, imagined your shock, imagined feeling vindicated and victorious. But the truth is, I didn't spend the last 10 years thinking about winning against you. I didn't wake up every morning plotting revenge or building my career to prove you wrong. I spent those years building a life where what you did to me simply didn't define me anymore. I paused, letting that sink in, watching my mother's face crumple further and Alison's expression cycle through denial and recognition. I didn't need to defeat you. I just needed to live well. And it turned out that living while building something real and earned and mine that was so much better than any revenge I could have imagined. Because revenge would have meant you still had power over me. Living well meant I'd taken that power back. My mother opened her mouth as if to speak, but I held up one hand, not aggressively, just a quiet signal that I wasn't finished, that she'd had 35 years to speak, and now it was my turn. She closed her mouth and waited, tears still streaming down her face. Here's what I realised in that taxi, and in the months and years that followed. I wasted 30 years trying to earn love from people who'd already decided I was strong enough not to need it. The words came easier now, each one a small weight I'd been carrying finally set down. You taught me that family doesn't mean unconditional acceptance. It means the people you're supposed to tolerate hurting you the most. It means the place where your pain doesn't count because someone else's fragility matters more. It means shrinking yourself into smaller and smaller spaces and calling that love. Alison made a sound, half protest, half sob, but I continued without acknowledging it. So I built a different family. Colleagues who respect my competence. Mentors who invest in my growth because they see potential, not because they owe me anything. Friends who chose to be in my life rather than being stuck with me by accident of birth. People who celebrate my successes instead of treating them as unremarkable. People who see my needs instead of assuming I don't have any. I looked directly at Sarah for a moment, and she gave me the smallest nod of acknowledgement. Then I turned my gaze back to my mother and sister. I didn't lose a family 10 years ago. I escaped one. And I built something better in its place. Something based on mutual respect and genuine care, rather than obligation and guilt, and this toxic hierarchy where one person's needs always matter more than another's. The conference room was silent, except for my mother's quiet crying and the ambient hum of the building's ventilation system. Ethan was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Something between devastation and recognition, as if he was seeing clearly for the first time the dysfunction he'd been raised in. "You're here today because you need something from me now," I said, shifting my attention fully to Alison. After 10 years of silence, after attempting to sabotage my career multiple times after showing up at my office, to create scenes after sending anonymous emails trying to get me fired, you're here asking me for a job. And I want to be very clear about something. I'm not here to punish you. I'm not here to get revenge. I'm not here to prove anything to you or to Mum or to anyone else. I straightened in my chair, feeling the weight of my position, not just director of recruitment, but someone who'd earned respect through integrity and competence. I'm here to make a fair professional decision. That's what I do. That's what I've built my career on. And based on this interview, based on your qualifications, based on your conduct today, including attempting to bribe our receptionist to access confidential interview questions, that decision is straightforward and documented. Alison's face had gone pale, but I saw something else there too. A kind of resignation, as if she'd known all along this would be the outcome, but had come anyway out of desperation or hope, or some combination of the two. "You don't meet the minimum requirements for this position," I said, my voice professional now, the same tone I'd use with any unqualified candidate. "You have no supervisory experience. You've demonstrated no ability to answer basic management competency questions. Your employment history shows a pattern of short tenures and lateral moves rather than progression. And your conduct during this interview, both the attempted bribery beforehand and the inappropriate emotional appeals during, violates our professional standards." I paused, then added, "This isn't about our history. This would be my assessment of any candidate who presented the same qualifications and conducted themselves the same way. The fact that we share DNA is irrelevant to the professional evaluation." But before I could finish articulating the formal rejection, before I could close this chapter and move forward, I realised I had one more thing to address. One more person who needed to hear what I'd learned, what I'd become, what I'd finally understood about worth and love, and the difference between the two. But before I could finish, I had one more thing to address, and it wasn't about Alison. I turned to face Sarah and David, shifting back into my role as Director of Recruitment, conducting a formal evaluation. The personal reckoning had happened, but now we needed to complete the professional business that had brought us to this room. Sarah met my eyes and gave a small nod, understanding that we were transitioning back to documented protocol. "Based on this interview, the candidate does not meet the qualifications for branch administrative manager," I said, my voice returning to the measured tone of professional assessment. "The position requires a minimum of 5 years of supervisory experience with direct reports. Ms. Lewis has provided no evidence of managing teams or holding supervisory authority in any previous role. The position requires demonstrated conflict resolution skills, budget oversight experience, and strategic planning capabilities. When asked for specific examples, the candidate provided only generalized statements without concrete details or measurable outcomes. I glanced down at my evaluation form, though I'd already made my decision within the first 15 minutes of the interview before Ethan's appearance had derailed everything into personal territory. Her employment history shows a pattern of short-term positions without progression or increasing responsibility. Her application essay, while articulating certain values, does not align with the documented conduct we've witnessed today. I recommend rejection based on insufficient qualifications. Sarah added her assessment, her voice crisp and professional, despite the emotional weight of everything she'd just witnessed. I concur with Director Lewis's evaluation. The candidate was unable to provide substantive responses to basic management competency questions. The attempted emotional manipulation during the interview represents a significant concern about professional judgment and boundaries. I recommend rejection. David Park, who'd been sitting quietly throughout the personal revelations, cleared his throat and leaned forward. His voice carried the authority of someone who'd been with Morris and Garrett for 2 decades and had seen every variety of candidate behaviour imaginable. I agree with both assessments regarding qualifications. However, I need to add an additional factor to our decision. He pulled out his phone and referenced a message. Our receptionist, Melissa Chen, documented an incident that occurred approximately 30 minutes before this interview began. Ms. Lewis approached the reception desk and offered cash payment. Melissa reports it was $200 to just peek at the interview questions for a few seconds. This offer was declined, and Ms. Lewis was informed that such requests violated company policy. The incident was immediately reported to HR and documented per our standard protocol. The weight of this addition settled over the room like a fog. Alison's face had gone from pale to ashen. David continued, his tone utterly neutral, simply stating facts. Per Morris and Garrett policy, as outlined in our candidate conduct guidelines, that every applicant acknowledges upon application submission candidates who engage in ethical violations during the hiring process are placed on our system-wide ineligibility list. This applies to attempted bribery, fraud, misrepresentation, or other conduct that violates our integrity standards. This is not personal discretion. It's standard protocol applied uniformly to all candidates, regardless of circumstances. He looked at Alison directly, his expression neither cruel nor sympathetic, just professionally distant. What this means practically is that your profile will be flagged in our applicant tracking system as ineligible for future consideration at any Morris and Garrett location for any position. This flag cannot be removed without executive level approval, which is granted only in exceptional circumstances, after a waiting period of no less than 5 years. The silence that followed was broken by Alison shooting up from her chair so abruptly it scraped against the floor with a sharp screech. "This is revenge!" Her voice was shrill, climbing toward hysteria. "You're punishing me for something that happened 10 years ago. This is discrimination based on personal history. I'll file a complaint with your HR department. I'll file with the EEOC. I'll get a lawyer and sue this company for discrimination and abuse of power. Everyone will know you used your position to get revenge on your own sister." She was breathing hard, her face flushed, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Our mother reached up to try to pull her back down into her chair, but Alison shook her off. "You can't do this. You can't use your job to destroy me. I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of person you really are, how vindictive and cruel you are, how you've held a grudge for a decade and finally found a way to hurt me." I waited until she'd finished, until she had run out of threats and accusations, and had nothing left but ragged breathing and tears of frustration and rage. Then I spoke with the same calm I'd maintained throughout this entire surreal morning. "You're welcome to file any complaint you wish. That's your right as a candidate," I said evenly. "Every aspect of this interview has been witnessed by 2 additional panel members, and recorded per our standard protocol. The evaluation was conducted using our established competency rubric, which is applied uniformly to all candidates at this level. My decision is based solely on your qualifications and your conduct today, both of which are thoroughly documented. I gestured to Sarah and David. The panel consists of 3 members, myself, Senior HR Business Partner Sarah Chen, and Vice President of Operations David Park. All 3 of us reached the same conclusion independently based on the same evidence and evaluated against the same criteria. This is not a single person's vindictive decision. It's a committee assessment following our standard process. I stood then, signalling that this interview was over, that the professional business had been concluded. I wish you the best in your job search, Ms. Lewis, but it won't be with Morris & Garrett Corporation. This decision is final and will be documented in our system today. You'll receive a formal rejection letter via email within 24 hours. Alison looked like she wanted to scream, to overturn the table, to do something violent and dramatic that would force everyone to acknowledge her pain and her rage. But she was 45 years old and standing in a corporate conference room with security cameras documenting everything, and some part of her understood that the rules were different here, that her usual tactics wouldn't work in this environment. "This isn't over," she said, her voice dropping to something quieter but no less venomous. "You think you've won, but this isn't over." I looked at my sister, really looked at her maybe for the first time in decades, and I felt something unexpected. Not satisfaction at her defeat, not vindictive joy at finally having power over her. Just a profound, exhausted sadness. For all the years we'd both spent trapped in a toxic pattern neither of us had created, but both of us had perpetuated in different ways. Then I did something that no one in that room expected, especially not Alison. I turned to Ethan, who'd been standing frozen near the door throughout the entire professional verdict, looking like he wanted to disappear into the walls. His face was pale, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his shoulders hunched in that universal posture of teenage mortification at adult conflict. He'd come here seeking absolution and had instead witnessed his family implode in a corporate conference room with professional witnesses documenting every devastating revelation. "Ethan," I said, my voice gentler than it had been for the rest of this conversation, "can we speak privately for just a moment?" He looked startled, glancing at his mother, as if seeking permission out of habit, but Alison was too consumed by her own fury and humiliation to register his uncertain expression. I gestured toward the hallway, and after a moment's hesitation, he followed me out of the conference room. Sarah, reading the situation with the intuitive understanding that came from 7 years of working together, moved to position herself near Alison and my mother, a quiet but clear message that they would wait here while I spoke with Ethan alone. I led him down the corridor to a small seating area near the windows overlooking the city, a space designed for informal conversations and pre-interview waiting. We sat in chairs angled toward each other, and for the first time since this entire surreal morning had begun, I allowed my professional mask to soften into something approaching genuine warmth. Not the performance of warmth that Alison specialised in, but actual human connection unfiltered by protective barriers. "That was a lot to witness," I said simply. "I'm sorry you had to hear all of that." Ethan's eyes, so like his mother's, but somehow clearer and more direct, filled with tears he was fighting hard not to shed. "I didn't know," he said, his voice cracking with adolescent emotion he hadn't yet learned to fully control. "About Grandma, about her knowing what Mum did. I always thought it was just me being a stupid kid who didn't understand. I didn't know Mum had planned it. I didn't know Grandma knew." "None of that was your fault," I said firmly. "You were 7 years old. The adults in that situation bear all the responsibility for what happened. All of it. You were used as a tool by people who should have protected you instead." He nodded, wiping roughly at his eyes with the back of his hand. "I've wanted to apologise to you for 10 years. I've thought about that morning so many times. about how scared you looked when you couldn't find your keys, about how I didn't understand why you never came back, about whether you hated me. I never hated you, Ethan, I said, and I meant it. I was angry at the situation, hurt by what happened, devastated by my family's response. But you were a child following instructions from adults you trusted. That's not something I could hold against you. We sat in silence for a moment, and I made a decision that felt both calculated and genuinely compassionate. The kind of decision that comes from having been given a second chance yourself and understanding the power of extending that opportunity to someone else. I want to tell you about something, I said, shifting slightly to face him more directly. Morrison Garrett has a youth mentorship program called the Future Leaders Initiative. It's designed for high school juniors and seniors who show leadership potential, kids who want to build professional skills, learn about corporate environments, get mentorship from people in various fields. If participants maintain a 3.5 GPA and complete the program requirements, there's a scholarship component for college. Usually covers about 40% of tuition at state schools, more at community colleges. Ethan's expression shifted from grief to cautious confusion. Why are you telling me this? Because you're 17 now, which means you're eligible to apply, I said plainly. I'm not offering you anything directly. I can't just give you a spot in the program. You'd have to submit an application, go through an interview process with the program coordinators, meet the academic requirements, and earn your way in just like every other applicant. But I wanted you to know it exists because I think you might be a good candidate for it. He stared at me like I'd started speaking a foreign language. But after what my mum did, after everything that just happened, you're telling me about opportunities. That doesn't make sense. It makes perfect sense, I said. 10 years ago, you were 7 and used as a weapon in an adult conflict. That wasn't your fault, and you shouldn't have to pay for it for the rest of your life. But you're 17 now. You're old enough to choose who you want to become. You don't have to repeat the patterns you grew up in. The manipulation, the emotional hostage-taking, the assumption that other people exist to serve your needs. I leaned forward slightly, making sure he was hearing not just my words, but the intention behind them. You don't have to pay for your mother's mistakes, Ethan. You get to build something different. But that's a choice you have to make actively every day. You have to choose to be different than what you were taught. His face was working through emotions too complex for 17 years to easily process. Why would you help me after everything? Because someone once gave me a chance when I was at my lowest and didn't deserve it by any logical measure. I said, thinking of Robert Morrison, seeing potential in a dishevelled woman who'd shown up 45 minutes late to an interview. He saw potential instead of failure. He chose to invest in me when he had no reason to, except his own judgment of my character in one brief interaction. I paused, making sure Ethan understood this next part clearly. I'm not your saviour. I'm not going to rescue you from your circumstances or fix your family dynamics or be the parent figure you might wish you had. But I can be someone who opens a door and tells you it exists. Whether you walk through that door is entirely up to you. You'd have to do the work, maintain your grades, complete the application, honestly interview well, show up consistently if you're accepted, prove yourself over and over again. And if I fail, he asked quietly, then you fail, and you learn from it, and you try something else, I said. But the failure would be yours based on your actual effort and capability, not because someone sabotaged you, not because someone decided before you started that you weren't worth investing in. You'd get a fair chance, which is more than some people get, but also exactly what everyone deserves. Ethan took a shuddering breath, and I saw something shift in his expression, a flicker of hope mixed with determination, the look of someone who'd been given permission to imagine a different future than the one that seemed inevitable. I want to apply, he said. I want to try. I don't want to be like... He stopped, unable to articulate what he didn't want to become, but we both knew what he meant. Then I'll email you the application information today, I said, standing and extending my hand for a professional handshake. The rest is up to you. Earn your own redemption, Ethan. Don't expect it to be given to you. He shook my hand, his grip surprisingly firm for someone who'd been crying minutes earlier, and nodded. Thank you for giving me a chance, for not hating me. You have to earn your own redemption, I repeated gently. I just opened a door. The rest is your work. As we returned to the conference room, my mother finally found her voice, and it wasn't to thank me. We walked back into the conference room to find my mother standing rigid by the window. Her face set in an expression I'd seen countless times growing up, that particular combination of wounded dignity and righteous indignation that she deployed whenever anyone suggested she'd made a parenting mistake. Alison had collapsed back into her chair, her face blotchy and tear-streaked, looking smaller somehow, diminished by the weight of her exposed manipulation. Sarah and David remained seated at the conference table, their professional composure intact, but their expressions revealing that they'd witnessed something extraordinary and were still processing the emotional wreckage. My mother turned as we entered, and instead of the gratitude I hadn't expected, but perhaps had foolishly hoped for, her face contorted with fresh anger. So, you'll help Ethan, but not your own sister? Her voice was sharp, accusatory, trembling with outrage. What kind of person punishes family like this? After everything we did to raise you, after all the sacrifices we made, this is how you repay us. You've become cold and cruel, Catherine. Success has turned you into someone I don't recognise. The words landed exactly where they were designed to land, that soft, vulnerable place, where even the strongest boundaries have weak spots, where the child you once were still lives and still desperately wants parental approval, despite knowing it will never come. For 35 years, that child had controlled my responses, had made me swallow hurt and shrink myself, and accept unacceptable things, because the alternative was facing this exact accusation that I was cruel, ungrateful, wrong, in some fundamental way. But I wasn't that child anymore, and something inside me, something that had been building pressure for a decade, maybe for a lifetime, finally broke free. When did you ever recognise me, Mum? The question came out quiet, almost gentle, but it carried the weight of 35 years of accumulated invisibility. Tell me one time, just one, when you looked at me and saw a daughter worth protecting instead of a resource worth sacrificing. When did I get to be fragile? When did I get to need you? My mother's mouth opened and closed, searching for an answer that wouldn't come because no answer existed. I didn't wait for her to formulate a deflection or make another excuse. The dam had broken, and the truth was pouring out in a flood I couldn't have stopped if I'd wanted to. I was 11 years old when I won the state science fair, beating 60 other kids, including 8th graders. Do you remember that day, Mum? I don't think you do because you weren't there. Alison had a cold, not the flu, not pneumonia, just a regular cold, and you stayed home with her while I stood on that stage alone looking for you in the audience, believing until the very last second that you'd somehow make it. The memory came with perfect clarity, sharp-edged and still capable of cutting. I was 16 when I got a full academic scholarship to college, full ride everything paid for. I was so excited to tell you, and you cried. You actually cried, but not from pride, from grief, because it meant Alison would be home alone without her sister to keep her company, without me there to buffer her disappointments and prop up her ego. My mother's face had gone pale, her hand clutching the back of a chair for support, but I wasn't finished. The accounting of my invisibility had been stored up for decades, and it was all coming out now. I was 23 years old when I got my first promotion, the first real step up in my career, proof that I was building something. I called to tell you, and do you know what you said after? That's nice, dear. You asked if I could lend Alison money for her boutique idea, the one that failed 6 months later. My achievement was just an opportunity for you to extract resources for Alison. I stepped closer to her, my voice still quiet, but carrying clearly in the silent room. When was I ever the daughter you protected, Mum? When did my needs matter more than Alison's wants? When did my pain count as much as her inconvenience? Or was I only ever the daughter who was strong enough not to need protecting, which is just another way of saying I was the daughter you could neglect without feeling guilty about it? My mother was crying, now silent tears streaming down her face, but I felt nothing watching them. No satisfaction, no remorse, no urge to comfort or recant, just a vast echoing clarity. You say I've become someone you don't recognise. The words came out sharp now, carrying an edge I'd never allowed myself before. But, Mum, you never knew who I was to begin with. You knew the role I played. You knew the function I served. The responsible one who'd handle things. The invisible one who didn't require attention. The one who'd survive whatever you took from her because she was just that strong, that capable, that self-sufficient. I paused, letting that sink in, watching her face work through denial and recognition. And I played that role beautifully. I played it so well, you believed it was who I actually was, instead of who I had to become to survive, in a family that had already decided one daughter was worth protecting and the other was worth using. I played it until the morning I sat in a taxi and realised that my silence wasn't maturity. It wasn't strength. It wasn't family loyalty. It was just me dying slowly while calling it love. The conference room was absolutely silent. Sarah had tears on her face that she wasn't bothering to hide anymore. David looked stricken, like he'd wandered into something far more painful than he'd been prepared for. Ethan was staring at me with an expression of recognition, seeing clearly, perhaps for the first time, the pattern he'd been born into and the choice he'd have to make about whether to perpetuate it. Alison had her face in her hands, shoulders shaking with sobs that sounded nothing like her earlier manipulative tears. And my mother just stood there, finally speechless, finally out of excuses and deflections, and ways to reframe reality into something she could live with. I'd said the thing she'd spent 35 years making sure never got said out loud. I'd named the hierarchy she'd constructed and maintained and benefited from. I'd made the invisible visible, and there was no putting it back in the box. And that's when I told them the truth I'd been carrying for 30 years, the realization that had finally set me free. I took a breath and felt the final piece click into place, the truth that had taken me 10 years of therapy, mentorship, and hard-won growth to fully understand and own. For 30 years, whenever I questioned the unfairness, whenever I asked why I was treated differently, you had the same answer, Mum. You'd say, that's just how family is. You accept each other, you endure, you sacrifice. Blood is thicker than water. I shook my head slowly, feeling the weight of those words, and how they'd been weaponized against me my entire life. But I finally understand what you were really saying. Family means I'm supposed to give people permission to hurt me without consequences. It means love requires accepting mistreatment as the price of belonging. My mother tried to interject, her voice weak and broken. That's not what But it is what you meant. I said not unkindly, just stating a fact. Whether you consciously intended it or not, that's the lesson you taught. That's the family system you built and maintained. And I'm here to tell you that I reject it completely. Loving someone doesn't require accepting mistreatment. I can love you and still refuse to be diminished by you. Those two things aren't mutually exclusive, they're actually necessary for any healthy relationship. I looked between my mother and Alison, these two women who'd shaped my understanding of love in such fundamentally broken ways. You taught me that love was something I had to earn through perfection and silence. Every A on my report card had to be perfect to matter at all. Every achievement had to be exceptional to warrant a moment of attention. And even then, the attention was fleeting, distracted, qualified. Meanwhile, Alison received unconditional acceptance for simply existing. She could fail, stumble, quit, sabotage, and she was still trying her best, still deserving of support and protection and endless accommodations. Alison made a sound from behind her hands, but I continued, needing to finish this accounting while I still had the courage. You created a hierarchy where her needs always outweighed mine, because her weakness was worth protecting and my strength meant I needed nothing, not recognition, not celebration, not even basic fairness. My strength became the justification for my neglect. Catherine can handle it. Catherine will be fine. Catherine doesn't need us the way Alison does. My voice caught for just a moment the only crack in my composure. But I did need you. I needed you so desperately it hurt. I just learned early that showing that need was pointless, that it would be met with dismissal or redirection to Alison's more urgent needs. So I learnt to compress my needs into nothing, to pretend I didn't have them, to become the low-maintenance daughter who asked for nothing because asking had never gotten me anything except disappointment. The truth of this settled over the room like ash after a fire. Sarah was openly crying now, and I realised that she was hearing her own story in mine, recognising the patterns she'd escaped from her own family. David had the expression of someone who'd accidentally walked into a tragedy and now understood its full scope. That morning, 10 years ago, standing in your kitchen with my keys finally back in my hand, but no time left to make my interview, I faced an impossible choice. I spoke directly to my mother, now needing her to hear this, needing her to understand even if she couldn't accept it. I could keep fighting for crumbs of approval from people who were determined not to see me, who'd already decided I didn't matter enough to protect. Or I could choose to see myself, to value myself, to believe that I deserved better even if my own family couldn't provide it. I paused, letting the weight of that moment hang between us. I chose myself, not because I'm cruel or vindictive or cold, but because I finally realised I matter too. My dreams matter, my pain matters. My need to be seen and valued and treated fairly matters. And I don't need your permission to believe that anymore. I don't need you to agree with me or validate my feelings or acknowledge that you treated me unfairly. Your recognition is no longer required for my self-worth. This was the heart of it, the core truth that had taken me a decade to fully internalise. I spent 35 years waiting for you to see me, waiting for you to choose me just once, waiting for evidence that I mattered as much as Alison, that I was worth protecting, that my suffering counted. And that morning, I finally stopped waiting. I stopped believing that if I was just good enough, perfect enough, understanding enough, you'd finally love me the way I needed to be loved. My mother was shaking her head, crying harder now, trying to speak through her tears. I did love you. I do love you. I know you love me. Mum, I said, and I meant it without sarcasm or bitterness. I believe you love me to the best of your ability within the limitations of who you are and what you're capable of giving. But your love comes with conditions I couldn't keep meeting without destroying myself. Your love required me to be invisible, to need nothing, to accept less. Alison could have more. And I can't live in that love anymore. It was killing me, slowly. I straightened my shoulders, feeling the full weight of the boundary I was about to articulate. I don't hate either of you. I need you both to hear that clearly. I don't hate you, and I don't want revenge, and I'm not trying to punish you by living well, but I will never again set myself on fire to keep you warm. I will never again accept that's just how things are, as justification for making me smaller. I will never again sacrifice my peace, my opportunities, my self-respect to maintain a family dynamic that only works if I'm willing to be diminished. The words came easier now, flowing from a place of hard-earned certainty. I love you both from a distance where you can't hurt me anymore. And that's not cruelty, Mum. That's not me being cold or unforgiving or holding a grudge. That's survival. That's self-respect. That's self-preservation. That's the only kind of love I have left, to give love that doesn't require me to accept mistreatment as proof of loyalty. Love that comes with boundaries that protect me, even if they disappoint you. I looked at Alison, then back at my mother. You're both welcome to think I'm wrong. You're welcome to tell yourselves I overreacted, that I am being dramatic, that I'm punishing you for ancient history. But your interpretation of my choices doesn't change what I know to be true. I matter. My well-being matters, and I finally love myself enough not to accept less than I deserve, even from family, especially from family. The room fell silent until Alison broke down and said something I never expected to hear. Alison's face crumpled completely, the last vestiges of her defensive posture collapsing into something I'd never seen from her before, raw, ugly, desperate crying that shook her whole body. This wasn't the calculated tears she'd deployed during the interview, the ones designed to manipulate and redirect attention. This was something else entirely, something that looked like it had been building for decades and was finally breaking free. You're right, she gasped out between sobs, her voice thick and broken. You're right about everything, about all of it. And I hate that you're right because it means I wasted my entire life being terrified of something that wasn't even real. I stood perfectly still, not moving closer or reaching out to comfort her, not sure I even wanted to hear what was coming next. But she continued, the words spilling out in a torrent that suggested they'd been dammed up for years. I didn't sabotage you because I hated you, Catherine. She looked up at me with eyes so swollen and red they were barely recognisable. I sabotaged you because I was terrified. Absolutely terrified that if you left and succeeded, if you built this amazing life somewhere else, Mum would finally see it. She'd finally see that she'd been protecting the wrong daughter all along, that she'd spent 30 years investing in the failure instead of the success, making excuses for the weak one while ignoring the strong one. Her voice cracked, and she pressed her hands against her face as if she could physically hold herself together. I needed you to stay. Not because I loved having you around, though. I told myself that's what it was, but because your presence, your struggle, your invisible suffering was the only thing that made my position secure. As long as you were there being the competent one who didn't need anything, Mum would keep protecting me, keep making accommodations, keep treating my failures as temporary setbacks instead of what they really were. I felt something shift in my understanding, not toward forgiveness, but toward a more complete picture of the dysfunction that had shaped both of us. Alison was still talking, the words pouring out faster now, as if she was afraid if she stopped she'd lose the courage to continue. You think being the favourite was a gift? She laughed a bitter, broken sound. It was a prison, Catherine. Every single time Mum made excuses for me, Alison's just sensitive. She needs more support. She's trying her best. I heard what she was really saying. She's weak. She's incapable. She'll never be enough on her own. She needs me because she can't survive without constant protection. Alison stood up, pacing now, her movements jerky and uncontrolled. I couldn't succeed, don't you see? I couldn't build something real, couldn't stick with anything long enough to get good at it, couldn't risk actually trying and failing because if I succeeded, I'd lose the only thing that made me valuable in this family. I was the daughter who needed protecting. That was my role, my identity, the only way I knew how to get Mum's attention and love. If I became competent and independent, what would I be? Just another person who didn't need her. The self-awareness in her words was stunning, and I found myself wondering how long she'd understood this, how many years she'd been conscious of the trap she was in, but unable or unwilling to escape it. She turned to face me directly, her face a mess of tears and smeared makeup. So I sabotaged myself as much as I sabotaged you. More even. Every business venture I started, I'd get scared when it started working. Scared of what success would mean. Scared I'd lose Mum's attention if I didn't need her anymore. So I'd self-destruct. I'd make stupid decisions, stop following through, find reasons to quit. And every time I failed, Mum would swoop in with comfort and excuses and support, and I'd hate myself for needing it, but also be relieved because at least I still had a place in her world. She sank back into her chair, looking smaller and older than 45, looking like someone who'd just seen, clearly for the first time, and couldn't unsee what she'd discovered. That morning 10 years ago, when I told Ethan to hide your keys, I wasn't thinking about your interview or your career. I was thinking, if she leaves, if she succeeds, Mum will see what I really am. She'll see that she wasted all that protection and accommodation on someone who never deserved it, never earned it, never became anything despite every advantage. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. I was terrified she'd finally see me clearly, and even more terrified that I'd have to see myself clearly without you there as comparison, without you there as proof that at least I was better than someone at needing her. The confession hung in the air, and I saw my mother flinch as if physically struck by each word. This was the bill coming due for 35 years of enabling, of creating a hierarchy that had damaged both daughters in different but equally profound ways. That doesn't make what I did okay. Alison continued, looking directly at me now. I know it doesn't. I'm not asking you to forgive me or feel sorry for me or understand me into excusing what I did. I used my own son, my 7-year-old child, to hurt you. I weaponized his fear of abandonment to destroy your opportunity. I tried to sabotage your career with anonymous emails and showing up at your office because I couldn't stand that you'd escaped and succeeded anyway. She took a shuddering breath. I became exactly what Mum taught me to be, someone who takes from strong people to prop up weak ones. Someone who believes other people exist to make my life easier, to absorb my failures, to sacrifice themselves so I don't have to face consequences. And now I'm 45 years old with nothing to show for it except a string of failures, a son who's ashamed of me, and a sister who's absolutely right to never forgive me. The silence that followed was different from all the previous silences. This one felt like the aftermath of something being destroyed rather than revealed. Ethan was staring at his mother with an expression of grief and recognition, seeing her fully, perhaps for the first time. My mother had collapsed into a chair, her face in her hands confronted with the full scope of damage her parenting philosophy had caused. Sarah and David remained professionally present, but clearly moved by witnessing this family's complete unravelling. I looked at the wreckage of my sister's life, at this woman who'd spent 45 years trapped in a role that had stunted her growth and poisoned her relationships, who'd sabotaged both of us to maintain a dysfunctional equilibrium, who'd finally seen clearly what she'd become and was devastated by the view. And I felt nothing. No satisfaction at her suffering. No vindication at her confession. No surge of forgiveness or desire to rescue her from consequences she'd spent a lifetime earning. Just a terrible, clarifying certainty about what I had to do next. I let the silence stretch for a long moment, watching Alison compose herself enough to sit upright again, watching my mother's shoulders shake with quiet sobs, watching Ethan process the full scope of the family dysfunction he'd been born into. The conference room felt heavy with the weight of truths that couldn't be taken back, revelations that had permanently altered the landscape of our family. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm, measured, carrying none of the emotional charge that had filled my earlier speeches. This was about practical decisions now, about what happened next, about whether we ended here in mutual destruction or whether something different was possible. I'm not going to tell you I forgive you, Alison, I said, meeting her swollen eyes directly. I don't know if I do. I don't know if I ever will. And I need you to understand something clearly. Forgiveness isn't something I owe you. It's not something you can demand or earn just because you finally told the truth. You don't get to confess and then expect absolution, like it's a transaction where honesty buys redemption. She nodded, not arguing, looking like she'd used up all her fight in that confession and had nothing left but exhausted acceptance. But I can offer you something else, I continued, and I saw confusion flicker across her tear-stained face. I can offer you a choice that I never got the chance to earn your own way forward. Not a guarantee. not a rescue, just an opportunity that you'd have to work for. I glanced at Sarah, who understood immediately where I was going with this, and gave a small nod of support. David looked interested, his professional curiosity engaged by watching me navigate this impossible situation with measured grace. Morrison Garrett partners with a vocational training program called New Horizons, I explained. It's designed for people in career transitions, people starting over, people who need to learn actual marketable skills. They offer tracks in office administration, project coordination, customer service management, basic HR, and accounting functions. It's a 6-month intensive program with job placement support at the end. The completion rate is about 60%, which means 40% of people don't make it through because it's genuinely demanding. Alison was staring at me like I was speaking a language she didn't understand. Why are you telling me this? Because I can refer you to the program. I sit on their advisory board. A referral from me would get you into the next cohort, which starts in 3 weeks. I paused, making sure she was hearing not just the offer, but what came next. But there's a condition. Actually, there are several. I straightened in my chair, feeling the weight of what I was about to require. First, you publicly apologise to Ethan and to Mom for how you used them. Not to me, to them. They're the ones you weaponized. They're the ones who deserve to hear you take full responsibility for manipulating them into being complicit in your sabotage. Ethan's head snapped up, his expression a mixture of hope and uncertainty. My mother's crying had stopped, and she was listening intently now, her face still wet with tears, but her attention fully focused. You made Ethan complicit in hurting me when he was 7 years old, I said, my voice firm. You used his abandonment fears to turn him into your instrument. You coached a child to sabotage an adult's career opportunity and then let him carry guilt for a decade that was never his to carry. He deserves to hear you acknowledge that, without qualification, without excuse, without, but I was lonely or but I was desperate. I turned my attention to my mother. And you made Mum complicit in covering for you. You relied on her enabling to shield you from consequences. She deserves to hear you acknowledge that you used her love and her guilt and her fear of losing you to make her an accomplice in your sabotage. Alison was shaking now, not from anger, but from the enormity of what I was asking. Genuine accountability, genuine acknowledgement, genuine remorse expressed without any of the defense mechanisms she'd spent her life perfecting. If you can do that genuinely, not as performance, not as manipulation to get what you want, then I'll make the referral, I said. You'll enter the program with no special treatment, no accommodations, no excuses. You'll have to show up every day, complete the coursework, meet the standards, prove you're serious about change. You'll have 6 months to demonstrate that you actually want to build something real instead of just existing as a perpetual victim of circumstances. I leaned forward slightly, making sure she understood the full scope of what I was offering and what I was requiring. At the end of those 6 months, if you complete the program, you'll have actual skills and job placement support. Not a job handed to you, but real assistance in finding something appropriate for your skill level. You'll have to earn every step. No shortcuts, no family favours, just the same shot everyone else in the program gets. Then I sat back and delivered the alternative. Or option 2, you walk away now with dignity. You decline the offer, and I'll write you a neutral, professional reference based solely on the work history you submitted in your application. I won't mention today. I won't mention our personal history. I'll give you a bland factual letter confirming your past employment dates and job titles that you can use to apply elsewhere. You can start fresh somewhere that I'm not involved, somewhere our history doesn't overshadow your opportunities. I met her eyes and held her gaze. Either path gives you more than you gave me 10 years ago, Alison. When you sabotaged my interview, you gave me nothing. No no choices, no chances, no dignity. Just sabotage and lies and manipulation. I'm offering you two genuine options, both of which represent respect for your agency, even though you've never shown that respect to me. The silence that followed was different from all the previous silences. This one felt suspended, poised on the edge of something waiting for a decision that would determine whether Alison was capable of change or whether she'd remain trapped in the patterns that had defined her entire life. Choose, I said simply, but choose knowing that if you pick the training program and don't follow through, if you start making excuses or expecting accommodations or falling back into your old patterns, I won't rescue you. I won't intervene. I won't give you a second chance at the first chance. This is it. This is your opportunity to prove to yourself, not to me, not to Mum, but to yourself, that you can build something real. Alison stood there trembling-faced with a choice she'd never given me, and what she decided would determine whether redemption was even possible. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. Alison stood frozen, her face working through emotions too complex to name. I could see her old patterns trying to reassert themselves, see her mind reaching for familiar defense mechanisms. But something in her seemed to understand that those tactics wouldn't work here, that this was a threshold moment, where she either stepped into genuine accountability or remained exactly who she'd always been. Finally, she moved. She turned to Ethan, who was still sitting near the door, and knelt down in front of him. Actually knelt, putting herself physically lower than her 17-year-old son. When she spoke, her voice was shaking but clear. Ethan, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I used your fear of losing people to manipulate you into hurting Catherine. When your dad left, you were terrified everyone else would leave too, and I knew that. I knew exactly what that fear felt like to you, and I used it. I turned your trauma into a weapon. Her voice cracked. What I did was wrong. It damaged you. It taught you that people you love will use your vulnerabilities against you. It made you complicit in something cruel, and then I let you carry guilt for 10 years that was never yours to carry. You deserved a mother who protected your innocence, not weaponized it. I'm so sorry. Ethan was crying openly, and after a moment's hesitation, he nodded. Not forgiveness exactly, but acknowledgement that her words had landed, that something between them might begin to heal, even if it would take years. Then Alison stood and faced our mother, who was still sitting with her face in her hands. Alison's voice was steadier now. Mum, I'm sorry I made you lie for me. I'm sorry I made you choose between your daughters by threatening to fall apart if you didn't protect me. I knew you'd always protect me, because I'd spent my whole life training you to, because I made myself seem breakable, and Catherine made herself seem strong. She paused, swallowing hard. I used that power to hurt Catherine over and over. And every time I relied on you to cover for me, to make excuses, to prioritize my needs over Catherine's pain. I turned you into an enabler of my worst behavior. That doesn't make what you did okay. You're responsible for your choices. But I'm responsible for manipulating you into making those choices. I'm sorry. The apology hung in the air. Our mother's face cycled through emotions, denial, recognition, grief, something that might have been the beginning of acceptance. She didn't say anything, just nodded once, a jerky movement that looked like it cost her everything. Alison turned back to me. I choose the training program, she said quietly. I don't know if I can do it. I don't know if I'm capable of following through, or if I'll fall back into old patterns. But I want to try. I nodded once. That took courage, I said, and I meant it without warmth or coldness, just stating a fact. Now comes the harder part, 6 months of actually doing the work, not just saying the words. I'll send the program information to your email by end of week. What happens after that is entirely up to you. I won't check on your progress. I won't be your cheerleader. You have to save yourself this time. Alison nodded, looking simultaneously relieved and terrified. Thank you for giving me a chance I didn't deserve. You don't have it yet, I corrected gently. You have an opportunity to earn it. There's a difference. The meeting was clearly over. Sarah and David stood gathering their materials. David shook my hand and said quietly, "That was the most extraordinary display of leadership I've seen in 20 years with this company." Then he left. Sarah lingered for a moment, catching my eye with a look that said everything. Later, her expression promised. Then she too left. My mother stood shakily. Alison helped her toward the door and Ethan followed, but he paused at the threshold. "Thank you," he said simply, "for the program information, for believing I could be different." Then they were gone. I sat down heavily and let out a breath I hadn't realised I'd been holding. 3.5 hours that had felt like 3 years. Sarah came back 15 minutes later with coffee and a sandwich. We sat in comfortable silence before she spoke. "You gave her more than most people would have." "I gave her what someone once gave me," I said. "Morrison saw potential in me when I was at my absolute lowest. I'm doing the same thing, just with stricter boundaries. And if she fails, then she fails," I said. "But it will be her failure based on her actual effort, not because someone sabotaged her. That's the difference." Over the following months, I deliberately didn't think about Alison or her training program. But periodic updates filtered through because I was on the New Horizons advisory board. Month 1. Alison Lewis enrolled, attending consistently initial assessments, show adequate baseline skills, but significant gaps in professional norms. Month 2. Consistent attendance maintained, showing improvement in time management struggles with accepting constructive feedback. Month 3. Notable improvement in receptiveness to coaching, completed project management certification, attendance record perfect. Month 4. Participated in mock interview workshop, received feedback about tendency toward emotional manipulation, demonstrated willingness to examine patterns. Month 5. Strong performance on practical assessments, hired for part-time internship, continues to meet all requirements. I read these updates clinically, refusing to let myself feel investment or hope. Alison's journey was hers to make or fail at. Ethan's journey I allowed myself to follow more closely. He'd applied in July, interviewed in August, and been accepted on his own merit in September. His progress reports were consistently positive, engaged participant, asks thoughtful questions, shows genuine interest in professional development, strong ethical compass emerging. I saw him once at a program event in November. He'd grown another inch, carried himself with more confidence. We spoke briefly professionally, and I saw in his eyes gratitude mixed with determination. He was building something different than what he'd inherited. December came, 6 months after that interview. Alison completed the New Horizons program with a 92% final evaluation. Her coordinator sent me a note. "Your sister showed remarkable growth. She's accepted a position as an administrative coordinator at a nonprofit. Whatever you said to her, it worked." I felt nothing reading that note. Not pride, not satisfaction, just a distant acknowledgement that Alison had surprised herself, which was probably the most important victory she could have achieved. 6 months after the interview, my mother appeared at my office on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, and what she brought with her would crack open the last sealed chamber of my heart. My assistant buzzed my phone at 3:15 on a grey December afternoon. "Catherine, your mother is here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's important." There was a question in her voice. Should I send her away? I stared at my computer screen, watching the cursor blink in the report I'd been writing, and felt my carefully maintained equilibrium tilt slightly. 6 months since that interview. 6 months of deliberate distance, of not reaching out, of letting them all figure out their own paths without my involvement or observation. And now, she was here, unannounced, crossing into the professional space I'd built as a sanctuary from family dysfunction. "Send her in," I heard myself say. My mother appeared in the doorway, and I was struck by how much smaller she looked than I remembered. She'd always seemed formidable to me, a force of nature. whose approval I'd chased and whose dismissal I'd absorbed. But the woman standing in my office doorway looked diminished somehow, as if the weight of the truth revealed 6 months ago had physically compressed her. She was 70 now, her hair fully grey, wearing a simple coat still damp from the rain. She was carrying a worn manila envelope and a small plastic container. "Catherine," she said, and her voice was smaller, too tentative, in a way I'd never heard from her. "I know I should have called first. I know you probably don't want to see me, but I needed to give you something, and I was afraid if I called, you'd tell me not to come." She wasn't wrong. I gestured to the chair across from my desk, the same chair where I'd sat with candidates and colleagues and Sarah, where I'd built a professional life that had nothing to do with the family that had never seen me. She sat down carefully, clutching the envelope and container like they were life preservers. "I made lemon bars," she said, setting the container on my desk. "From Grandma's recipe. You used to love them when you were little. I know it's been 20 years since I made them, and I know a batch of lemon bars doesn't fix anything, but I didn't know what else to bring, except something that said I remember. I remember who you were, what you loved, even though I did such a terrible job showing it." I looked at the container and felt something crack in my chest. Lemon bars. My grandmother used to make them for me every time we visited, and after she died when I was 12, I'd asked my mother to make them, and she'd said she would but never did because Alison didn't like citrus. And here they were 23 years later, sitting on my desk like an archaeological artifact from a childhood I'd mostly survived rather than enjoyed. "Thank you," I said because I didn't know what else to say. She took a shaking breath and held out the envelope. "These are letters, 10 of them, one for each of your birthdays since you left. I wrote the first one 6 months after you walked out. I'd finally understood how empty the house felt without you, how the silence where you used to be was this loud, terrible thing. But I was too ashamed to send it, too ashamed that I'd let you go so easily, that it took your absence to make me see you. So I kept writing one every year and never sending any of them." I took the envelope but didn't open it, just held it, feeling its weight. 10 years of unspoken words, 10 years of private reckoning I'd known nothing about. "I don't know if you'll want to read them," she continued, her hands twisting in her lap. "They're probably inadequate, they're probably too little, too late, but they're the truth, Catherine. They're me slowly, painfully, finally seeing what I did, what I failed to do, who I failed to be." We sat in silence for a moment, and then she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "The first letter is confused. I didn't understand why you wouldn't return my calls, why you'd cut us off so completely. I thought you were being dramatic, punishing us. By the third letter, I was starting to admit maybe I'd favoured Alison too much. By the 7th, I used the word betrayal for the first time. By the 10th, she paused, tears forming. By the 10th, I wrote that I was proud of who you'd become, even though I knew I didn't deserve to be. That you succeeded not because of our family, but despite it. Despite me." I felt my throat tighten but kept my expression neutral, refusing to let her see how much this was affecting me. "Why now?" I asked. "Why bring these now 6 months after everything came out?" "Because I've been in therapy since that interview," she said. "Every week trying to understand why I needed Alison to be weak to feel like a good mother. Why I needed you to be strong so I could neglect you without guilt. Why I built a hierarchy that damaged both my daughters in different but equally devastating ways." She wiped at her eyes. "My therapist asked me last week what I was afraid would happen if you read those letters. And I realised I was afraid you'd see how long I knew how many years I spent writing about my failures in private, while doing nothing about them in reality. How I kept choosing comfort over change until you forced the truth into the open in front of witnesses." She looked directly at me, then her eyes red but clear. "I can't give you back your childhood, Catherine. I can't give you back the mother you deserved, one who saw you celebrated, you protected, you chose you at least half as often as I chose Alison. I can't undo 35 years of making you feel invisible and calling it strength. But I needed you to know I see it now. I see you now, even if it's 30 years too late. Even if you can never forgive me. I finally see you. The words hung between us, and I felt a decade of carefully constructed walls trembling. Not falling, I wasn't ready for that, might never be ready for that, but trembling, showing cracks where light could get through if I allowed it. I don't know what to do with this, I said honestly, gesturing to the envelope and the lemon bars. I don't know if I can forgive you. I don't know if seeing me now after everything is enough to rebuild what you spent 35 years destroying. I know, she said. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking for anything except maybe someday when you're ready we could have coffee. We could start over as two adults instead of mother and daughter with all that history. We could see if there's something salvageable in the wreckage. She stood to leave and I didn't stop her. But as she reached the door, I spoke. Thank you for the letters and for the lemon bars. I'll read them when I'm ready. I can't promise when that will be. She nodded, something like relief crossing her face. That's more than I deserve. Thank you for not turning me away. After she left, I sat staring at the envelope and the container for a long time. I held those 10 letters, and for the first time I had to decide, was I ready to let my mother try to earn her way back into my life? I didn't open them. Not that day. Instead, I called Sarah and asked if she had time to talk. She appeared in my office 10 minutes later, took one look at my face and the items on my desk and closed the door behind her. We sat together in the chairs by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. My mother was here, I said. She brought 10 years of letters she never sent. 10 years of private reckoning I knew nothing about. Sarah was quiet for a moment, then asked, gently, how do you feel about that? I don't know, I admitted. You never asked for details about my family before that interview, but you always knew exactly when I needed space and when I needed company. How? Sarah smiled, but it was sad, weighted with understanding that came from experience. I told you once I had a sister. I said it in past tense, not present. That wasn't an accident. She looked out at the rain. We haven't spoken in 15 years. She was my Alison, or maybe I was her Catherine, depending on how you look at it. Either way, our mother chose and I was the expendable one. I left and never went back. I turned to look at her, fully seeing in her face echoes of my own pain, my own choices. You never told me the whole story. Because it wasn't about me, she said simply. When you told me about your family that first year we worked together, I recognized that pain immediately. The pain of being strong enough to survive being unloved, so no one thinks you need love at all. I wanted to see if things could be different for you, if chosen family could heal what blood family broke. So, I stayed. I became the sister you got to choose instead of the one you were stuck with. I reached across and squeezed her hand. You already knew it was possible to build a life after that kind of loss. You were proof I could survive it. Thank you for being the sister I got to choose. She squeezed back. And now you will get to decide if there's room in that life for a mother who's finally learning to see you. No pressure, no timeline, just the possibility if and when you're ready. 3 years later at a corporate leadership conference, I heard a voice I hadn't heard in 13 years and came face to face with the man who'd started it all. The National HR Leadership Conference was being held in Chicago that year. 3 days of workshops, keynote speakers, and networking events that I'd normally find tedious but had attended because Morrison Garrett was presenting on our innovative recruitment strategies, and I was the featured speaker. At 48 years old, I'd been promoted to Senior Director of Talent Acquisition 6 months earlier and was being considered for Vice President of People Operations, a role that would put me in the executive leadership suite and make me one of the youngest VPs in company history. I was standing in the hotel lobby during the afternoon break, reviewing notes for my presentation the next morning when I heard a voice I hadn't heard in 13 years, but recognised immediately. Catherine Lewis. I'd know that focused expression anywhere. You always looked like you were solving complex problems, even when you were just reading a menu. I looked up, and there he was, Robert Morrison. Older now, his hair fully white instead of steel grey, his face lined with the comfortable wrinkles of someone who'd lived a good life and retired on his own terms. He was wearing casual slacks and a blazer, instead of the corporate uniform I remembered, and his eyes held the same sharp intelligence mixed with warmth that had seen through my disaster of an arrival 13 years ago and decided I was worth investing in anyway. "Robert," I said, genuine pleasure flooding through me. "I heard you'd retired. What are you doing at an HR conference? My wife is presenting on change management. She's a consultant now. I'm just here for moral support and the free coffee." He gestured to the cafe. "Speaking of which, do you have time? I've followed your career from a distance and I'd love to hear how you've been." We settled into a corner table with coffee, and for a moment I just looked at him, this man who'd fundamentally altered the trajectory of my life by seeing potential where anyone else would have seen only disaster. "I owe you everything," I said simply. "You know that, right? That morning, that interview, you saved my life." He shook his head gently. "I gave you an opportunity. You saved your own life by what you did with it. But I have to admit, I've taken a certain amount of pride in watching you climb from management training program to senior director. Your reputation in the industry is exceptional. The paper you published last year on ethical recruitment practices was brilliant." "You read that?" I was genuinely surprised. "I read everything you publish. I told you that first day I saw something in you." He took a sip of coffee, then said, "Do you ever think about that morning? The interview where you arrived 45 minutes late, wearing jeans, carrying only heartbreak and car keys." I smiled, feeling the weight of those 13 years between that moment and this one. "I think about it all the time. It was the worst day of my life and the first day of my real life all at once." "That's what I saw," Morrison said, leaning forward with the intensity of someone sharing an important truth. "That day, you walked in late, dishevelled, and told me the truth about what had happened. You could have lied. You could have crafted some sanitized version that made you look better. You could have made excuses or played victim or tried to manipulate my sympathy. Instead, you showed grace under the absolute worst circumstances." He paused, making sure I was hearing him. "Grace isn't about never falling, Catherine. It's not about perfection or always having your act together. Grace is about who you remain when everything's falling apart. Who you choose to be in your lowest moment, that's the truest measure of character. And that's leadership." I felt tears prickling at my eyes and blinked them back. "I didn't feel graceful that day. I felt destroyed. And yet, you showed up anyway. You told the truth anyway. You prioritized the opportunity over your pride anyway. That's what I bet on, not your resume or your credentials, but your character under pressure." He smiled. "Best bet I ever made professionally speaking." We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, and then I found myself saying something I'd never articulated out loud before. For years after that morning, I thought success meant proving them wrong, proving to my family that I was worth seeing, that they'd made a mistake in dismissing me, that I was valuable after all. Every promotion, every achievement, I thought it was building a case that would someday make them understand what they'd lost. Morrison nodded, listening without interrupting. But the real transformation happened when I stopped needing their validation, when I stopped measuring my worth by whether they finally recognized it. I wrapped my hands around my coffee cup, feeling the warmth. I succeeded because I finally believed I deserved good things, not because I earned them through suffering or perfection or being strong enough to survive neglect, but because I was inherently worthy of them. That's what you gave me that day, not just a job, but permission to believe in my own worth. "I didn't give you that permission," Morrison said gently. "I just recognized it was already there, buried under a lifetime of being told it wasn't." You did the work of excavating it, of building a life on that foundation. That was all you. We talked for another hour about his retirement, about his grandchildren, about my presentation tomorrow, about the industry changes we'd both witnessed. When we finally stood to leave, he hugged me, something he'd never done in all our years of professional mentorship, and said quietly, "I'm proud of you. Not just for what you've achieved, but for who you've become. You took unthinkable pain and metabolized it into wisdom instead of bitterness. That's rare. That's everything." Walking back to my hotel room that evening, I thought about the life I'd built in the 13 years since that disastrous morning. I thought about Sarah, my chosen sister, who'd stood beside me through every major moment and never asked for anything except honesty and presence. I thought about the team of 35 people. I now led each one knowing they worked for someone who saw them, who valued them, who would fight for their professional growth, because I understood what it felt like to be invisible. I thought about my mother, who I met for coffee every few months. Now, cautious, boundaried contact that would probably never be warm, but had achieved something like honest respect. She'd stayed in therapy, had started volunteering at a family counselling centre, had written me a letter on my 47th birthday that simply said, "I see you now, and I'm sorry it took so long." We would never have the mother-daughter relationship I'd craved as a child, but we'd built something new from the ruins, two adults who shared DNA and history, and were learning to coexist with mutual recognition. I thought about Alison, who'd completed that vocational training programme and had been working as an administrative coordinator at a non-profit for nearly 3 years now. We exchanged brief emails a few times a year, updates about her work, about Ethan, careful messages that maintained distance while acknowledging connection. We weren't close. We might never be close, but we were no longer weapons aimed at each other's hearts, and that felt like victory enough. And I thought about Ethan now, 19 and finishing his freshman year at State University, who'd graduated from the Future Leaders Initiative with honours and had written me a thank you card that said, "You showed me I didn't have to repeat the patterns I was born into. You showed me I could build something different. Thank you for opening the door." He was studying psychology and social work planning to work with at-risk youth, determined to break cycles of dysfunction for other families, the way he'd broken them for himself. People asked me sometimes if I'd forgiven my family for those lost years, for the systematic neglect and the deliberate sabotage and the 35 years of being invisible. The truth was complicated. Forgiveness wasn't a single moment, wasn't a switch I flipped one day that made everything okay. It was a practice, something I returned to again and again with varying degrees of success. Some days I felt generous, able to see my mother and sister as flawed humans doing their best with limited tools, able to recognise that hurt people, and cycles of dysfunction are hard to break. Other days, I still grieved for the mother. I never had the childhood I deserved, the sister who might have been my ally if we'd been raised differently. Both things were true. Both would probably always be true. But I'd learned the most important truth of all: I didn't need their redemption to be complete. I didn't need their apology to be whole. I didn't need them to fully understand what they'd done, didn't need them to feel adequate guilt or remorse or recognition. I needed to stop waiting for them to see me and start seeing myself. And on the day I did that, on that morning 13 years ago, when I sat in a taxi driving away from everything I'd known, when I walked into an interview 45 minutes late and chose honesty over image, when I accepted Robert Morrison's offer and decided to bet on myself, even when no one else would, on that day, I finally came home to the person I was always meant to be. That wasn't revenge, though people sometimes mistook it for that. Revenge would have meant they still had power over me, that my success was defined by their failure to appreciate me. This was liberation. This was building something so solid and real and mine that their validation became irrelevant to my sense of self-worth. I stood at my hotel room window, looking out at the Chicago skyline, at the lights beginning to glow as evening settled over the city, and I felt something I'd never felt in my childhood home peace. Not the false peace of conflict avoidance or the toxic peace of self-abandonment, but genuine peace, the kind that comes from knowing exactly who you are and being perfectly content with that person. And some days, that was more than enough. Some days, that was everything. If you've made it this far in my story, thank you for listening. Thank you for staying with me through every painful revelation, every moment of growth, every won victory. 13 years ago, I walked out of my childhood home carrying nothing but car keys and heartbreak, believing I'd lost everything. Today, I understand I didn't lose anything that day. I found myself. People often ask me what I'd say to my younger self, to that 35-year-old woman sitting in a taxi, crying her eyes out, convinced her life was over. I'd tell her this: the family that breaks your heart doesn't get to define your worth. The people who made you feel invisible don't get to determine whether you matter. You matter because you exist, not because you've finally achieved enough to earn basic recognition. And the moment you truly understand that, the moment you stop seeking approval from people, incapable of giving it, that's the moment you become free. I tell her that chosen family is just as real as blood family, sometimes more so. That she'd find people who would see her value, her celebrate her. That she'd build a team who would respect her, not despite her scars, but because she'd learned to transform pain into wisdom instead of bitterness. I'd tell her that forgiveness is complicated and non-linear, that some days she'd feel generous and other days she'd still grieve, and both responses are valid. That her mother would eventually try to make amends inadequately, but genuinely. That Alison would surprise everyone by actually growing. That Ethan would break the cycle and build something different. But most importantly, I'd tell her this living well isn't about making them regret what they lost. It's about building a life so authentic and fulfilling that their opinion of you becomes background noise you barely register. It's about waking up in a home that feels safe, working with people who see you, and looking in the mirror at someone you genuinely respect. That's not revenge. That's liberation. My story doesn't end with perfect reconciliation or fairy tale justice. It ends with realistic peace, hard-won boundaries, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing I built something real from absolute wreckage. The truth I've learned is this: you can love your family from a distance where they can't hurt you anymore. You can acknowledge their efforts to change without forgetting what they did. And you can choose yourself without being selfish. Sometimes choosing yourself is the most necessary, most loving thing you can do. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and self-preservation? Have you ever walked away from people who loved you but couldn't see you? Have you ever had to build yourself from nothing because the foundation you were given was poisoned? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. This community is here to listen without judgment. If this story resonated with you, if you saw pieces of your own journey reflected in mine, please subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Every week I share real stories about people who chose themselves, who built lives worth living from impossible circumstances, who learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is set boundaries with people who refuse to see your worth. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Someone struggling with toxic family dynamics. Someone questioning whether they're wrong for protecting themselves. Someone wondering if there'll ever be enough. They need to know they already are enough. They always were. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being part of this community where we honor survival, celebrate growth, and recognize the courage it takes to choose yourself. Until next time, remember this: you don't need anyone's permission to matter. You already do.